This is Spectacle of Power, a fiction podcast written by Logan Reynolds, with sound by Timothy Brunskill. Prologue, The Shortest Night. The town was alight, every inch of it consumed by deathly heat. People scampered, frantic as wildcats, until cornered and forced to wrestle the blaze. Debris was desperately heaped on the burgeoning flames. A townsguard, panicked by the unnatural swiftness and intensity of the threat, unlatched his chest plate and launched it hopelessly onto the stack. Insuppressible, the tendrils of fire continued to rage. At the rear gate, another guard heaved his sword in clumsy circles, fighting a phantom enemy, his visage twisted with confusion. A moment earlier, he had seen a cloaked man step through a wall of flame, only to weave back out again, unmolested by its power. The same man's laughter now rose above the elemental roar, sharp and bloodthirsty. Foul warlock! The guard gasped, half mad and swinging. Demon! All sounds of resistance were soon washed out under the maleficent drone of the inferno. No screams, no moans, no profanity-laden effusions remained. All had succumbed to the ambush of destruction. It was done. Overlooking the valley, a small assembly of soldiers awaited their master's return. Their eyes were fixed on the town below, an orange orb of light flickering in the black firmament of the vast country. Some of them smoked, others shuffled in tense silence. Their secondary involvement in the night's activities had cast an awkward, restless mood over the encampment. As foot soldiers, they were not accustomed to playing second fiddle. There he is, one of them whispered at last. The other soldiers looked intently into the shroud of night, straining to make out the outline of their general. At last he lumbered into view, a slight limp betraying the physical exertion of the past hour. My lord, you have succeeded? The man did not answer at first. Instead, he withdrew a flask from his gambeson and hungrily downed the sweet wine within. He wiped his lip with his sleeve. At ease, he spoke, partially revived. Tonight we have shown our enemies the very price of insolence. Let them be an example to all who would seek to obstruct our path. Under my banner, there will be no restraint, and there will be no mercy. The soldiers jeered, uninhibited and exalted. More wine was fetched at once from the barrel which they had hauled uphill and across dale. They would savour the victory before returning to the south. Overhead, a soldier noticed a hawk swoop past, the silver of its wings catching the light of the moon. It screeched, suddenly and full-throatedly, excited by the violence. Chapter 1. One foot in front of the other. The travellers convened for dinner in the evening's half-light, the falling sun casting a golden softness over empty plains. Karnik tinkered with a campfire, adding kindling and blowing on the capricious little flames. His brow fissured with concentration. Look steady, Caspar remarked, helping himself to a bowl of stew. The protein was a variety of venison, sinewy but flavourful, especially with the addition of Nima's foraged herbs and dark berries. She had recently taken to long walks in the mid-afternoon. In her absence, Caspar often found himself worrying, kneading over scenarios of increasing horror in his mind. After all, there was an abundance of bandits in this part of the country, as well as creatures better left undisturbed. Yet Nima always returned, and usually with a bulging satchel under her arm, the huntress and her bounty. Wind's picking up, Karnik said. We ought to find a more sheltered spot when we camp tomorrow. Auburn-haired siblings Lennox and Letus took their place next to Caspar. Letus carried his characteristic sneer, displeased as usual with the offering, but he did not complain. His fatigue was too great. It'll be another 3 days at least before we reach Cyril, Karnik continued, his voice deep and solemn. "That is assuming the weather holds. The skies have been darkening." "Rain might not be such a bad thing. It would bathe the horses at least," Lennox said. Leaders hummed in agreement. "They stink." Karnik frowned. "If it were just a short visitation of rain, yes. But the Verda is known for tempests, great wrathful outpourings. We would need to take cover, possibly for days, and that would slow our advance to a crawl." "And our contact is expecting us soon," Casper chirped. He had joined the new Wardens only a couple of months ago, but had felt an immediate, empowering sense of purpose, and it was yet to abate. He liked that they were always moving, always striving towards a destination and a goal. A few paces away the horses whinnied. Nima passed a comb through the mane of her silver mare, gently caressing the animal's jaw. As Casper turned to see her, an errant sheet of wind suddenly lifted the light blue fabric of her dress. Silhouetted against the horizon, long hair and linen adrift, it struck him that she resembled a beautiful wraith. Lennox cocked her head, disquieted by the image. "Will you join us, Nima? The stew's delicious." "Why, yes. I'll be over shortly. Thank you." The party sat in silence for a short while, wooden ladles scraping on wooden bowls. Beneath the pot, the flames continued to flicker, lending their life-preserving power. Karnik reclined into a more comfortable position and allowed himself to relax, though only a smidgen. Casper was the first to break the silence. "Could you tell us a story, Karnik?" A pause. "Again, lad." "If you wouldn't mind," Casper replied with boyish curiosity. "You have such interesting tales." Karnik bowed his head, a trifle embarrassed. "Only if it will not bore the others." Lennox shook her head. Letus cast a hand in the air, his expression one of apathetic assent. "Well, all right. But where to start tonight?" Karnik's face, a great boulder weathered by the events of a fully experienced life, tensed in consideration. He contemplated the many stories he might pluck out of the archive of his memories, those he might repeat like an incantation and thus breathe in new life. He hesitated. Some of them frightened him, even then after all those years. The man who towered well beyond 6 feet, who maneuvered a battle axe with the dexterity of a cutlass, was still troubled by the shadows of his past. "There is something I ought to share with you all," he said, finding his resolve. "I have not broached the subject before, did not see the purpose until now." As Karnik spoke, Nima joined the group. She kneeled behind Casper, her eyes fixed on the undulating flames of the campfire. "Yet now we journey to Cyril, a city-state that is well connected and active in the continent's affairs. No doubt we will hear plenty about their concerns in the south, that which concern my childhood home, and the mad dog who's taken up the mantle of command." Casper mouthed the name of the southern general to himself, so strange and foreign to his tongue. Ithgarod. Lennox exchanged a questioning glance with her brother. "And even though I would prefer not to revisit this chapter," he said, wincing a little, "it is right you should hear it. It is time." With a loose branch, he absently poked the campfire, then continued. "I have told you before that my family came to Visualiser from the Broken Islands when I was very small. My father was a craftsman and sold carvings from a stall. They were a novelty, really. When that business dried up, he found work in the mines. It was back-breaking, but he saw it as dignified in its own way. As Broken Islanders, it is not in our nature to shy away from hard work. My mother, and by extension myself when I was older, worked in a wealthy merchant's home, mostly seeing to cleaning and other domestic chores." "What was the family like? Did they treat you well?" Casper asked. Letus let out a sigh, unreasonably irritated by the interruption. "Must you ask every question that springs to mind?" Karnik ignored him. "Oh, more or less. The merchant was a shrewd businessman, but not vindictive. His wife was quiet for the most part, sullen. They had a son too, a couple of years my junior. At the time he went by Thane, although that name is all but lost to the wind now. Anyway, when I was about 12 we became friendly, in that easy way children who are brought together through luck and circumstance seem to manage. We had little in common, in truth, but I was grateful to receive his civility. Not everyone was so lucky. The boy had a scolding temper at times, and his parents were frequently the target of his ire. He seemed to have unlimited reserves of contempt for them, their lifestyle, and their simplicity, as he put it. And he didn't view your family in the same way? Lennox asked. No, at least not on the surface. Rather, I think he glorified our limited means, saw us as participants in a sort of noble struggle. He was an unusual child, philosophical beyond his years, and brooding as a result. But as I said, he was kind enough to me. My family lived in the Mud Quarter, he continued, a squalid neighbourhood on the fringe of Visualiser. It gives me no pride to recall that we were actually better off than most families in the area. Most boys my age were pulled into some illicit dealing or another. Mouths had to be fed, so it was an inevitability. I even knew a couple of boys, good lads, who worked at calm houses with their sisters, serving the upper classes. A grubby business, one might remark from a perch of privilege, but certainly safer than drug smuggling or petty thievery. Who could begrudge them? Caspar bowed his head empathetically while the siblings looked on, attentive. Nema's face was unreadable as she stared into the distance. Anyway, he said, Thane wanted to see the Mud Quarter one afternoon, so we went. His parents had forbidden him from journeying to such a cagey part of the city, but such refusals are no way to dispel a precocious child's curiosity. So I led him through the narrow corridors of the quarter, or downhill or slick from the runoff of central Visualiser, and he seemed to enjoy the backdrop, the squawking and hollering of the markets, snatches of conversation passed from window to window, entryway to balcony. There was a chumminess in Visualiser, you see. We looked after our own. Of course, in every community there are spoiled eggs, and our paths soon crossed with one such group of children, a few years older than us. I was showing Thane the stream that snaked behind my family's home. For the most part it was an unremarkable little body of water, somewhat dirty, not particularly idyllic, except for the tiniest glints of indigo in some of its stones. It's difficult to explain, but I always felt there was a touch of magic about the place, a quality that elevated above its drab setting. In fact, looking back, I think it probably helped me to appreciate beauty, and to see it even in the most mundane environments. I didn't know you were so sentimental, Karnak, Ledis remarked smugly. Lennox needled him in the ribs. What? Carry on, Kay, she insisted. The gang of boys chanced upon us when we had our guard down. I should have known better, should have warned Thane there were opportunists about. The leader of the pack was a brute named Ivano, the type whose only currency was cruelty. Who's your fancy friend? He sneered. Thane's fine clothing had apparently given him away. Get out of here, Ivano, I returned. Already I could feel my cheeks flushing with fear. I was big for my age, solid, but he was even bigger, and partial to knife play, I understood. Furthermore, and this was what concerned me most, on that day he had dragged along his enormous hound. My Aram, Caspar whispered. How did you escape? Or did you fight them all off? I was not yet so proficient in the art of combat, Karnak smiled. And as you know, I'm lost without my axe. No, it was actually Thane who stepped forth, facing down their nasty grins, with the stoniest expression I'd ever seen. My name is Thane Baltari, he said, voice steady. Is there going to be trouble here? Why, yes, Ivano spat. I think you'll find you're in a world of trouble, friend. Bit far from your mansion on Rich Prick Hill, aren't you? What happened? Did you trip and roll down? At this, the boys cackled and exchanged satisfied glances. Thane maintained his glare, the tension rising. Finally, Thane spoke again. I would advise you to turn around and leave. Please. Please? Bah! Hear that? The twerp begs for mercy. I had noticed as we were squaring off, the hound becoming increasingly agitated. It was now baring its teeth, snarling, straining against its leash. Just go home, Ivano, I said. We're leaving anyway. I don't think so, Barkskin. The party's hardly begun. Suddenly Ivano lunged forward and struck the hound on its hide. With the lead released, The creature roared to life and surged towards us, eyes bloodshot and blazing with savage intent. I bolted. It seemed like the reasonable thing to do, and expected Thane to follow at my side. Yet curiously, he did not. When I reached the road's edge, I turned back and was surprised to see him still by the stream, rooted to the same spot. His arms were outstretched and there was smoke billowing from his palms. A smouldering wreckage lay before him. He had incinerated the dog. There was a noticeable pause as the goons failed to comprehend what had happened. Then, as they finally regained their bearings, Ivano started to scream. "You killed my pup! You fucking bastard!" Thane took a single step forward, his leather shoes partially submerging in the stream. I could not see his expression, but Ivano and the others recoiled immediately. Are you going to kill us?" The most cowardly among them whimpered. The colour had drained from his face. Ivano's too, though his fists remained clenched in a defiant posture. Perhaps not. I certainly will if you stick around here, but surely you aren't as stupid as you'll look. With that cue, the group disbanded, fleeing back down the trail towards the swamplands where they lived. Ivano was the last to recede entirely from view, battling with his own pride, I'm sure, but even he, in his profound idiocy, knew not to trifle with a sorcerer. Thus, he lived to brutalize another day. Now, returning to the purpose of the story. Do you know who Thane grew up to become? Karnik asked of the others. Leadus, who now had a grave look on his face, was first to answer. Ithgarod, the exile of Esward. Indeed. The same man who is now ruthlessly consolidating his power in the south, who considers himself a liberator of the Vizcan people and calls himself their commander, though a butcher is what he best resembles. I had no idea you'd met him, Lennox said, anxiously flattening her crop of hair. I wish I had not, in truth, Karnik replied, a flicker of sadness appearing on his face. Please, do not think I deliberately suppress his connection from you. I only saw him a handful of times after the incident. Something in our relationship had broken, irrevocably, from that day onward. Perhaps he sensed my uncertainty about him, something which only multiplied after witnessing his talent for destruction. I also suspect the growing darkness inside of him diluted any real need for friendship. Eventually he was shipped off to Esward to hone his gift, as it was called. Our paths never crossed again. There was silence around the campfire. Caspar was in quiet awe of the revelation, while the siblings seemed to grasp for words that would not come. It was Nima, in the end, who broke the lull. He must be quite a monster, she said in her sweet lilt. To be your friend, bathe in the light of your goodness, and still choose a path of shadow. It was an unexpected comment, and Karnik was touched. Thank you, Nima. Conversation meandered for a while, mostly on the subject of weather, how long it would take them to reach Cyril, and the plant life Nima had observed on the plains, prickly purple Morathagus being her favourite, until everyone but Karnik retired to the tents. He stayed awake for another hour, lying uncomfortably on his side, watching the last stand of the embers. It was no surprise to him when his mind finally wandered back to Vizca, through the complicated corridors of his memory, to his youth and the melancholic boy he once thought he knew. How wrong he had been. How wrong the continent would be to underestimate him now. Sleep came uneasily that night. Chapter 2. The Thousand Bridge City. Asher Emmering closed his eyes, succumbing to the relaxation that his restless body so desperately needed. He had hardly slept the night before. Too much was ticking over in his mind. Too many opportunities and possibilities and risks. In the steaming bath of the Cyrilese calm house, he felt his muscles finally relent. Not long after, a familiar pattern of footsteps roused him. His eyes shot open, taking in the porcelain grandeur of the bathing chamber, and he twisted sideways to spy the approaching figure. A silver-haired man extended a hand in greeting, his lopsided gait unmistakable. John Cade, Bastinian. From his back, Asher shifted to an upright position. He needed his wits about him. Matters of statecraft, after all, required a mindset of absolute precision. You took your time, the young man scolded. Terribly sorry, Asher. My associate was late, John Cade replied, not sounding apologetic in the slightest. His moustache was a well-groomed thicket. It made him look pompous, which he was, and sly. A sorceress with a punctuality problem. How unoriginal. Apparently there was some trouble on the road. Nothing to worry about. She did, however, bring some scintillating news. Asher cocked his head. Oh? John Cade's eyes gleamed. Can I get in? Aram give me strength, Asher thought. But he nodded. A few moments of queasiness was a worthy price for information. John Cade abandoned his robes in a careless tangle, then lowered his aged body into the hot water. Across his upper abdomen and chest was an angry scar, healed by the passage of time, but undulled in its gruesome effect. He'd shown it to Asher before, ostensibly as a badge of pride, a souvenir from his days of hobnobbing with Cyril's criminal underground. These days, as the proprietor of the Valor West Shipping Company, he sought to cultivate a cleaner image. Well, what did the witch disclose? She reports another settlement has been destroyed. Sagetown, it's called, just a stone's throw south of Itelga, and this time the devastation was wrought by Ithgarod's own hand. Boy, he's getting tenacious. Asher's lip curled in mild distaste. Or careless, what's he playing at? Oh, you wanted to send a personal message, I expect, after those simpletons had the gall to refuse his accord. As for Itelga, for such an atrocity to occur under its nose, to a village within its own limits, Roma and her officials must be furious. I just hope Ithgarod knows what he's doing, Asher said, calculating. The moral high ground is easily abdicated, and not so easily restored. John Cade flashed his teeth. Oh, but surely we're long past that point. Asher continued, ignoring him. Well, it's only a matter of time before Itelga lobbies us for aid now. They'll want to firm up their military force, and not a moment too soon with that wolf nipping at their heels. The time for our part to play in this has arrived. Right you are, John Cade nodded. We should talk numbers then. Both men served on the Proctor's Council, Cyril's governing board, which over the years had garnered quite a reputation for backroom bargaining, nepotism, and a general lack of transparency. Once a proud institution of leadership, at least at the time of Cyril's independence and the establishment of its lofty constitution, since watered down, the Proctor's Council was now the source of much consternation among common folk. Of the 7 proctors, 3 are prepared to entertain a deal of some design with Ithgarod, John Cade said. That's us, and witless Auric Plant, of course. Money well spent to shepherd him in line. Part of me still worries he was too easily brought. I understand your concern, but trust me, his loyalty can be relied upon. As sure as the sun. Fine, but even with Auric, we still need to flip 2. With Luke Hyde, let's face it, those bridges are torched. Oh, a door is never entirely closed, John Cade philosophized. Then seeing Asher's narrowing eyes added, But I agree, he's not likely to be inclined to help us this time. Not after we had his wife incarcerated. Albeit temporarily. Asher lifted his lean frame onto the ledge of the pool as John Cade watched him, his beady, sparrow-like eyes lingering a moment too long on the younger man's physique. So that leaves Abe, Marson, and Paquin, Asher said, counting on his fingers. I don't fancy our chances with Abe, now that he's found faith. He practically spat the last word. John Cade scratched his perfectly manicured moustache. But Marson Silkwater, our jolly wine baron. I'd wager he could be persuaded. With enough of his fine vintage, the lout could be persuaded to walk off a short pier, Asher retorted, and smiled for the first time that evening. You're not wrong, young Asher, you're not wrong. And what of Paquin, then, your once betrothed? Ugh. Despite being a modern society in most respects, Cyril clung on to some antiquated traditions. Arranged marriages were still considered the proper and natural course, especially when they suited the interests of the houses being adjoined. Asher had been 16 when he received the news. His life was to be entwined with the heiress Paquin Lingada. Neither party was pleased with the arrangement. He still recalled her biting words as the pair hovered awkwardly in the corridor of her parents' great manor. You understand this will not work, right? I'm sorry, Escher. You're pretty enough to look at, and that might be enough for most girls. But my interests lie elsewhere. Pardon the bluntness, but you unsettle me. I'm not enthralled with the idea either, had managed, resentment inflating his words. Her rapier tongue had wasted no time wounding his pride. But there are reasons to put our own preferences aside, economic reasons. She had then made a dismissive noise in her throat. You sound just like your father, and mine. Worry not, Escher. I will see an end to this nonsense. The union was indeed scuppered, much to the chagrin of Escher's father. On the night he heard the news, he struck his son hard across the face. After all your mother and I have sacrificed for you, you might have at least tried to make a good impression. Good-for-nothing swine. The pain of the memory felt disconcertingly fresh, despite being 15 years old. His father took ill in the same year, and while it was another 3 before the fever finally carried him off, his relationship with Escher was unmendably frayed. He had seen his son in a new, unflattering light, this time from the vantage point of others, as a sneering loner, handsome but hollow. But in the time since, Escher had proven himself worthy of the Emerine family legacy, and much more still. He had become a proctor, a man of real status and influence in the city. By rallying the most charming version of himself, and cutting a few profitable alliances along the way, he had succeeded in stilling the naysaying whispers of the Cyrillese ruling class, at least temporarily. It was said Cyril boasted the finest gossip mills in all of the continent. His only regret was that Paquin, the woman who had made him feel so small, had also ascended to the halls of power along with him. Fate, it seemed, had a bitter sense of humour. John Cade continued. I know you don't like to talk about Paquin, but listen, there could be an angle here. She's in a frail state, your girl, all holed up in that dour house. You've seen what her attendance is like at the Proctor's Council. Whether it's illness or something else, no one can say, but word is she's spooked by her own shadow. So I've heard, but how does this help us? There's nothing more persuasive than fear. Escher scoffed. You suggesting we strong-arm her, like a common pair of thugs? That is but one path. As the men were speaking, an attendant appeared between one of the Calm House's archers and glided towards them. Good gentlemen, might I offer you some wine? Or help you to quench another thirst, perhaps? We offer the company of women and men, fully credentialed and recommended by the Guild of Reviving Hands. No, Escher curtly replied, irritated by being interrupted, and swatting the man away with a gesture. The attendant's hospitable smile did not falter. Later for me, friend, John Cade said less abrasively. I'll seek you out in due course. The attendant bowed and turned to leave. Unlike John Cade's uneven stride, which had stirred the echoes of the bathing chamber, the attendant barely left a sound in his wake. He'd make a fine assassin, Escher quipped in his mind, before turning his attention back to John Cade. Did I hear you correctly? Did you wish for us to intimidate Proctor Lingada? John Cade smirked. Maybe it will not be necessary. All I know is that winning this vote will be the single most important thing either of us do. The sorceress made it clear. If we help to secure Cyril's neutrality under the guise of ambivalence, indifference, concern that our involvement will widen the scope of the conflict, whatever, then they are willing to support our ambitions on the other side. Not only in reshaping the political landscape here in Cyril, but perhaps in reshaping the entire continent. Ithgarod understands the value of having allies that he can trust, especially for the new world he's building. Escher, my boy, if we just hold our noses and get through this trying period, there's everything to gain. Escher dressed quickly, covering himself in the maroon robes that communicated his high station, and emerged into the night. It was only a short walk back to his house, one that took him over a couple of ornately paved footbridges and along the edge of Jordica Bay. Hundreds of moored ships rocked gently in time with the breathing of the ocean, their decks honey-glazed in candlelight. Those who visited Cyril often found it difficult to satisfactorily articulate her beauty, such were the limitations of language. To Escher, though, she possessed a quality even greater than her aesthetic charm. A sort of receptiveness to ambition, he thought. While demarcation by class remained an obvious reality, and the lion's share of power still belonged to a few ruling houses, there existed in tandem to this an almost mythological reverence for the underdog, an unspoken respect, you might say, for the battler who was determined to climb the social ranks in possession of little more than hard work and a harder stomach. Ruthlessness, much as some might deny it, had solidified itself as a Cyrilese value. Asher lingered at the water's edge. It was a warm night, and the muted soundscape gave no indication of the city's vast population. He thought of his wife, Clementa, and wondered if she was in bed. He imagined her propped up with a wine goblet in hand, reading a dusty tome in the lamplight. It's just as well she finds companionship in her fantastical novels, Asher thought. These days her husband is barely home before midnight. I wonder if she sometimes suspects me of having an affair. He hoped not. Marrying Clementa had once been a pragmatic decision, but his affection for her was quite genuine now. Perhaps he was not such a monster. He continued along the promenade, passing only a handful of people, including a pair of giggling lovers. There was freedom in the darkness. Nobody recognized him. At least that was Asher's perception. As he passed a tavern, the Broad Hearth, he was unaware of being appraised by a set of eyes on its third floor. The eyes, with lustrous silver irises that rippled like sand, belonged to a woman mostly beset in shadow. Even if by some random impulse Asher had looked up at that moment, he would not have been able to decipher her age, nor the expression she was making. For the next few minutes she continued to watch him intently from her lodging. Eventually he passed over another footbridge and disappeared around the corner. Something on her lap suddenly writhed, and with her gaze still fixed on the empty street, she moved to caress it. "What do you think?" the woman asked in a slow, trance-like voice. "Can we trust these people?" Chapter 3. Friends and Enemies. As a rule, Paquin Lingard tried not to leave her house. The high walls that encircled her estate were a comfort, and behind them she could breathe properly. She was not a recluse, of course. That would be overstating the situation, and she had no problem correcting, curtly, any gossip who deigned to peddle such misinformation. After all, Paquin was still a serving member of the Proctor's Council, and this responsibility dictated her attendance at committee meetings and voting ceremonies. Had she dutifully attended every one of these in the last month? No, not as such. But how could anyone blame her after the startling news she had received? On this particular day, Paquin had compelled herself to make the short trip to the city dome. It was an important day, one that necessitated a steely resolve. Her steward Ekel met her at the carriage, tenderly taking her pale hand as she stepped up. "What's the time, Ekel?" she asked. "12:15, my lady," he replied, quickly checking his pocket watch. "Right on schedule for the meeting." The carriage jerked through the spiderweb of narrow streets that made up Cyril's old town. Despite being born there, Paquin had never acclimatized to the vaguely cadaverous smell of the canals. It was impossible to refute the beauty of the ancient city, however. The red-roofed buildings with their intricate stonework, pointed arches, and striking asymmetry were as lovely as Jordica Bay itself. Each structure, while distinct, seemed to have been conceived with the same talented artist's brush. "The matter we spoke of yesterday. Has there been an update?" Paquin asked Ekel, who was in the driver's seat. "There has, my lady. Pardon me for not saying so earlier. I did not wish to wake you prematurely." "No matter. What information do you have for me?" Ekel directed the horses through a tight opening. Ahead of them, a young boy donned a brief look of alarm before levelling himself against the alley's wall. "Your guests arrived in the city this morning by way of the Pearl Gate," he replied. "They're staying centrally at the Swordfish and Sons." "A baffling choice." "It's guild-affiliated, my lady, which probably means discounted prices." "I see. And do you suppose they're up to the task?" "I do, my lady. There's 5 of them, including 2 casters. Their leader's as big as a mountain, a broken islander." "Goodness. Well, I should like to meet with him as soon as possible." "Certainly. I will see to it once you've finished your council meeting." Would you have them meet you at the estate? Paquin pondered for a moment. No, not right away. We ought to extend some Surly's hospitality first. They've come a long way, crossing the Verda. Eccles considered this, then snapped his fingers. I could organise tickets to the Water Theatre. Once these words had left his mouth, he felt a small pang of regret, remembering at once how his mistress despised leaving her estate for frivolities, and even less for a throng of overexcited theatre-goers. Her response, however, surprised him. Yes, that's a fine idea. Make it a private box. I do not wish to be overheard. The art form dates back 700 years, Letus, who was Surly's by birth, explained to Nema. His mood had markedly improved since arriving at the theatre. For all of his cynicism, and there was enough of it to sink a 3-mast ship, he was unfailingly proud of his homeland. The 5 of them were seated on a balcony, overlooking the long pool of water where the play was about to commence. One end was shallow, hemmed in by rushes, with a protruding rock flat enough to accommodate at least a couple of people. The other end of the pool was significantly deeper, and might have resembled a black void in the theatre's low light, but for a fascinating innovation. See those orbs, Letus said, motioning to the glowing orange spheres drifting in the water, illuminating the bottom of the pool in a sort of hypnotizing dance. They're a species of fish called candlespar. When disturbed, they change colour. Blue, purple, and red. They'll help us to see what's happening when the actors are submerged. How interesting, Nema exclaimed, looking more animated than she had in days. Our parents had a tank of miniature ones when we were growing up, Lennox added. I've never liked the idea of something so beautiful being contained, though. Karnik, who was sitting with Caspar farther back from the platform's edge, found his broad mouth turning upward. Nema seems refreshed, doesn't she? Caspar nodded. It's nice to see her smiling again. Even cranky Letus appears more upbeat today. So I've noticed. Although in his case, the sudden shift is a mite disconcerting, Karnik laughed. I suppose this is just the effect of being back in civilization. The winds of the Verda seem a world away now. Behind them, a curtain flung open, and Paquin, along with an unanticipated companion, stepped through the threshold. You must be Karnik Lesher, she greeted him, clasping his hand. The woman was waif-thin and sallow in complexion. Forgive my tardiness. I was ambushed in the lobby by one endowed with a knack for speech, the emphasis being on quantity rather than quality. This is my colleague, Proctor Marson Silkwater. Nice to meet you both, Karnik returned hoarsely. And let me introduce my retinue. This is Caspar Vartan, a swift sword. Lennox Martolian, bow specialist. Letus Martolian, an elemental caster. And Nema Leybourne, our mender. Wonderful. A mender is a rarity these days, isn't it? And what is it you do? Generally, ma'am, I smash things with an axe. Goodness. Marson leaned in a little closer, a conspiratorial look resolving on his face. I'm afraid, things being as they are, we may have use of your skill set, and soon, very soon. His words were imprecise, verging on slurred. For some reason, Karnik had the urge to recoil from the statesman. That is usually why we are hired, Proctor Silkwater. Would you care to elaborate? While they conversed, a hush had descended on the theatre. A moment later, applause rumbled from the lower floor. The performance was beginning. Come, let's take our seats, Paquin said, guiding Marson by the arm. The next hour and a half was a dizzying spell of aquatic dance, swordplay, and rhythmic instrumentation. The actors became monsters of the deep, growling from iridescent painted faces when above water, their fabric costumes manipulated to resemble scales and adorned with coral-spiked accessories. The narrative was a dark affair, revolving around a princess who toppled from her barge and drowned, only to be reborn in the maw of an ocean canyon. Unwilling to submit to a new master, for she was of stubborn, surly stock, a plot detail that amused the audience, the princess was exiled by the high priest who had summoned her, and then pursued for her transgression. It was during one of the later scenes, a gratuitous climax in which the princess was surrounded by lustful, jeering fiends, that Paquin turned inward to address Karnik again. It pains me to say, but there are parallels between this poor creature and myself, she said with a cadence of deep melancholy. Really? Karnik asked, surprised by the sudden pivot. But who hunts you, Proctor? I can't be certain, she said, a slight tremor coming over her. but an attempt on my life will be made, and before the month's end, I'd wager." "How do you know this?" Although he interrogated her, there was warmth in his voice. Given her wasting appearance, he surmised she had not slept properly in quite some time. "A teller, one blessed with the ancient gift. Her name was Ogmeda, and in my foolishness I sought her out. Tell me, Kanik, do you believe in a teller's power, their foresight?" "I'm not entirely sure," he said sincerely. "My mother sometimes spoke of a teller in Tibble Khan. They called her mad, yet it was said she could anticipate anything. Floods, miscarriages." "Precisely," Paquin breathed. "Even assassination, which is the very fate that awaits me, unless someone by Aram intercedes." Trembling, she motioned for Kainik to follow. They withdrew to a hallway behind the viewing box, and there, in an unravelling heap, she shared the circumstances of her cursed meeting with the teller. Beneath them, now out of view, heavy drums quickened as the princess thrashed in desperate, dancely movements. 3 months ago she'd heard a teller, a card reader, was in town. The crone's presence was contentious among some of the proctors, chiefly Abe Faircurtain, who had recently joined a peculiar religious sect and was itching to extend some righteous indignation. The council set to deliberating over whether to oust the woman, worried that she might dispirit the masses with her nonsense. "If we allow blasphemy to step through our gates, that will be just the start of things," Proctor Faircurtain warned. Ultimately, however, the decision settled on letting her be. Prohibiting her trade risked lionizing her, and moreover it was thought the good judgment of the Cyrillese people ought to be trusted. Surely very few would actually choose to partake in her game of lies. Yet for Paquin, the tiniest thought had begun to nag at her, a thought that only grew in scope and persistence over the next few days. "I have loved only one person in my life. Beyond familial ties, that is," Paquin said to Kainik. He had to focus hard on what she was saying. Her voice rose barely above a whisper. "The feelings happened quite unexpectedly, when I was just a girl, balancing on the edge of adulthood. I met someone at my academy, someone very special, and for a season we were inseparable." She went on to speak fondly of the company they kept, how they tittered into their textbooks in the shade of the ivory-flowered sanguina trees which lined the academy lawn, how they walked for at least an hour each day along the pebbled edge of Jordica Bay, watching the ships and making up stories about drunken captains and wayward crews. They were drawn into each other, and neither side was willing to put up much of a resistance. "When her father found my letters, he was furious," she said, a far-off look descending on her colourless face. "You see, the Cyrillese custom is to marry who you are told to, and my love, my Setia, was promised to another. I do not wish to dwell too much on the past. After all, that preoccupation is what spurred me into the path of the teller in the first place. But suffice to say, she did marry that boy. That ordinary boy. And more painful still, they left Cyril the very next year. Apparently his family owned an estate in the north, and it was thought the fresh start would do them both good, a means of strengthening the relationship, for I suppose it was already on the rocks. I was distraught, angry at the world, angry at myself for being so vulnerable, and for years I lived with the venom of regret. The pain lessened over time, of course, as it always does, and I was thankfully able to tuck it away for the most part. I focused on my career, managing some investments and then becoming a proctor. But I never entirely stopped wondering what had become of Setia, with those eyes of deep walnut, so incapable of scorn. And frustratingly, nobody seemed to know. Her parents had long left Cyril too, with rumours of unpaid debts following them. It was as if she'd vanished from the whole damn continent. So, when I heard the teller was in the city, a queer thought occurred to me. If the crone's magic was real, a big if, then she would surely know of Setia's whereabouts. She could tell me if there was a chance that we might someday be reunited. Once the thought was willed into existence, it was like a bruise, a dull throb in my side, impervious to time's healing. I knew I had to try. Paquin travelled to the park where the teller and her followers were understood to be operating. She remembered walking past the imposing statue of St. Jordica, whose handsome, superior face bore down on her in judgment. Repeatedly she questioned the wisdom of her endeavour. Had she finally lost her grip, consorting with such a creature? Ogmeda was sitting on the steps of her caravan. There were half a dozen of the portable homes lined up in a messy row, laundry lines strung between them like sails. The oxen which had brought the foreign travellers to Cyril grazed in the field with simple expressions, untroubled by human pain. To Paquin, their ignorance was a luxury. Ogmeda was a squat woman, with crudely drawn features and a gash of missing hair at the front of her scalp. One of her eyes was markedly larger than the other, and in her hands she was holding what looked like a child's doll, made of cloth and sodden with dirt. "Are you Ogmeda?" Paquin asked after a pause. "Mm-hmm. And what is your name, girl?" "Paquin Lingara." There was a moment of disbelief as Paquin realized how easily she had relinquished her full name. Was the woman's magic already at play? Again, a small voice in her mind begged her to change course. "Is there something I can do for you?" Well, she faltered. The folly of the errand was truly laid bare in that moment. She was a grown woman, an official representative of the city, yet here she was behaving like a naive maiden, addled and love-struck at the end of a summer fling. She felt a lurch of shame roil within her. Ogmeda spoke again, this time with an edge of authority, of knowing. "Perhaps you'd prefer to speak inside." Like a detached bystander, Paquin saw herself moving toward the woman's caravan. Something was compelling her forward, a force beyond her own unappeasable curiosity, and she was powerless in its control. The caravan was humid and stuffy, choked with a thick botanical fragrance that was more unpleasant than purifying. Ogmeda's possessions were strewn about in a tumble of chaos. Bundled up clothing, books open at dog-eared pages, bowls long abandoned that were stained with soup. On the far wall of the living space, jewellery hung from jutting nails, volcano glass bracelets, shark-tooth earrings, and pendants of ruby, jade, and tourmaline. "I'm a collector," Ogmeda said, noticing that Paquin was eyeing her display. "I've always had an affinity for shiny things. Come, sit, and speak your will." There was a small table in the centre of the room, less soiled than the other surfaces. A sheep's hide had been tossed over it, yellowing at the edges. The woman sat at an arm's length. "To be honest, I'm not sure what possessed me to come," Paquin said, finding her voice again. "I've heard stories of your kind. Not that I necessarily believe them. I mean no offence, truly. But I think I must have briefly lost my mind. Being here, it's not right." Ogmeda looked nonplussed. "But you are here. You would surely not leave without the information you seek so dearly." Paquin bit her lip. She could feel the invisible pull again. No, I suppose not." "Then it's settled. Now there's just a small matter of payment, and we can begin." "Oh." Paquin had forgotten, in her anxious preoccupation, the fundamental principle of commerce. Yes, of course. How much do I owe you?" The teller lowered her eyes. "That ring is rather lovely." Paquin shook her head, taken aback. "No, I'm sorry, it was a gift from my mother. I wouldn't part with it." She recalled her right hand from the table, removing the golden band from view. Ogmeda nodded, disappointment writ on her visage. "Very well then. 50 mirror should cover our session." Paquin withdrew 5 ochre-coloured coins from her satchel and passed them over. It was a much fairer price than the ring, so much so that Paquin felt a jolt of irritation at the woman's gall. The doll from earlier reappeared in Ogmeda's grasp, and flipping it over in a quick motion, Paquin saw a small zip tucked behind a fabric lip. The coins were quickly stashed. It struck Paquin as a curious precaution, but when she thought about it, it made sense. How many times had the woman been turfed out in the middle of the night by a brigade of city guards? How often had they raided her personal treasury in the process? "Well, let's proceed, shall we?" Ogmeda said, scratching the discoloured spot where a tuft of hair should have been. "Tell me, what is it you seek?" With a short, weary breath, Paquin began to speak of Setia. Time had eroded some of the specificity, but the essence of the girl she loved, and the memories they shared, encounters pitifully brief in the scale of time, yet no less poignant, buoyed to the surface. A smile, unable to be suppressed, blossomed upon her face. Ogmeda pursed her lips, half listening, mired in thought. You called her Coral sometimes, didn't you? Because she was forever daydreaming of the ocean, the secrets it kept. Used to tease that she had coral in her head. Yes, Paquin said, astonished. Can you sense her? Do you know where she is now? The teller glowered as she considered the questions. Strangely, and perhaps accentuated by the dappled light, the flesh of her face appeared heavier now, droopy as if weighted down. Great sacs hung under her eyes and her cheeks were slack. She bore the unfortunate resemblance, Paquin realized, of a melting cake. Finally, Ogmeda spoke. Unfortunately, the girl is dead. It was a cold statement, harshly matter-of-fact. Paquin recoiled, not quite comprehending, as a wave of sickness rattled in her gut. What do you mean? She stammered. I know it's not what you wanted to hear, but I won't deceive you with niceties. The truth is what brought you to my doorstep, and the truth you shall have. The girl succumbed to mottle fever 2 years ago. It was a savage bout, but mercifully quick. Her husband's never been the same, nor her parents. A nasty business indeed. Paquin opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came. In all her years of wondering, she had never thought, never dared to entertain the ridiculous notion that Setia might have met a premature end. It was too cruel for words. She did think of writing to you, Ogmeda continued, this time with a gentler tone. But she did not want to burden you with such misery. Probably for the best, child. I assumed that would be the worst of the woman's news, Paquin explained to Karnik, who was still listening carefully in the theatre corridor. But then, just as I was leaving, she started to convulse. It was a horrible sight, although I'm ashamed to say I found myself transfixed by her inhuman movements. I reached to assist her, and for a moment she appeared to snap out of it. Only then the ranting began. Death. Death is a glutton, and there is always more suffering to be had, oh yes, for it is never full. Death, which happily delights itself. Ogmeda hopped up in a delirious splay of limbs and seized the deck of cards from her dressing table. Furiously, she shuffled the thick stack, as clumsily as a bear trying to undo a sailor's knot, and laid out 3 cards on the table. In the frenzy, Paquin caught sight of some of the cards' illustrations. They were hand-painted, decorated with the utmost care, and enchanting in a bleak sort of way. With her forefinger, Ogmeda caressed each one, muttering what sounded like an incantation under her breath. She drew 3 cards, Paquin recounted. The first was a boot with a concealed dagger. Betrayal. The second, a branch with golden leaves. This means the turn of a season. And finally, a carriage with a missing wheel. Death. All of this points to one conclusion, Ogmeda warned. Namely, that my own end is near, by the design of someone I know, and likely before the cold season arrives. This is why I enlisted the help of the new Wardens, Karnik, and hastily at that. Apart from sweet Marson, who has been nothing but kind to me, I can't trust anyone in this damned city. He opened his arms to her as she crumpled inward, and her voice, which had been strong enough to conjure the tale, now devolved into a series of whimpers. He held her tightly, feeling a mountain of sadness for the woman. It occurred to him then, somewhat guiltily, that it was possible he and the others in his company had travelled all that way to keep vigil over a lie, one poison-fed by a charlatan whose chief profession was the procurement of fear. Yet something niggled at him. His own mother had been an ardent believer in the teller of Tibble Khan, whose predictions she insisted were accurate. Though she was prone to superstition, she was no fantasist. Could such powers really exist, in the Broken Islands and elsewhere? Marson Silkwater suddenly appeared next to them in the foyer, startled by the scene. Paquin, dear? Is everything all right? When she did not answer, he took her by the arm, in a firm, fatherly way, meeting her puffy-eyed expression with one of exaggerated tenderness. Oh, there. You've overdone it tonight, haven't you? Poor thing. Let's get you home, She was led off without protest, stopping only to offer Karnik a brief look of gratitude for having endured her story and her unfettered emotion. A second later he was alone, accompanied only by his thoughts and the muffled applause of the audience. Chapter 4, A Drink to Health. It was a week later when Marcin, in spite of his better judgment, opened the door to an unscheduled visitor. While he first intended to ignore the vigorous rapping on the door, he soon found that it would not be so simple, for they were surprisingly persistent in their entreatment to be let in. "Hold your horses," he exclaimed, fiddling with a network of locks designed to keep the public and his creditors at bay. "What in Aram's good graces? Oh, John Cade, it's you." "Forgive the intrusion, old friend," the fellow proctor said, revealing sharp teeth beneath a grove of facial hair. "It's a matter of some urgency that I speak to you. It's rather late, isn't it? Are you sure this can't wait until our meeting tomorrow?" John Cade stepped toward him, removing his coat. "I'm afraid the time is of the essence. Again, I beg your pardon. Might I trouble you for a glass of your exceptional Silkwater Red?" Marcin folded his arms, considering his options, but not seeing a way of dispatching his guest without causing offence. Resigned to the fact that his evening would not be the solitary affair he'd hoped for, he nodded and walked to the kitchen, where a bottle was already open on the counter. Marcin stepped over a cask of wine on his way to the dining area where John Cade sat, fingers steepled. His house had long been a repository for overflowing stock from the storehouse, and this year the volume had increased markedly. Partly to blame for the oversupply was the increase in competition coming through the harbour. Small vineyards in Tibble Khan and Esward were quickly becoming the flavour of the month, while appetite for Marcin's vintage was cooling. It dismayed him to a degree, of course, but he was not entirely surprised. In his experience, the Surleys were a fickle bunch. "I'll get straight to the point," John Cade said, taking a bread knife, slicing through creamy Castonian cheese, and lathering it on a crusty haunch of sourdough. "The situation between Itelga and Vizika is rapidly deteriorating. We find ourselves in the unenviable position of having to take a side." "Take a side?" Marcin repeated. "I'm surprised to hear you speak of such a thing. Under Ithgarod's deranged leadership, Vizika is surely the aggressor, plain and simple. What are you talking about, take a side?" John Cade appeared impassive. "Well, sure, we can agree that Vizika has not always acted as nobly as fine men like ourselves might desire. But nonetheless, given the complex and real entanglement in front of us, don't we have a responsibility to weigh things up carefully, objectively? There could be a once-in-a-generation opportunity here to again strengthen Cyril's place in the world, to, let's say, redraw the borders a touch, just as Jordica once dreamed of, I remind you, our city's most lauded hero." "You can't be serious," Marcin replied, looking aghast. "Is this what you intend to sell to the other proctors? Heresy?" He had always loathed John Cade. They were not so far apart in age, both endowed with family money, both successful in their respective enterprises, though his vineyard could not reasonably compete in scale with John Cade's shipping operation. But despite these pillars of commonality, he never felt the pull of friendship. In fact, for all of Marcin's fallibilities, and there were numerous, including his proclivity for drink and his carelessness with money, he could not deny that, in the end, he felt superior to the old conniver. In John Cade he could smell the malice and ill intent. It was not buried far beneath the surface. "Heresy, you say? That strikes me as a little naive," he said, bringing the goblet to his lips. "Asher certainly doesn't see it that way. Nor does Auric. Tell me, what do we actually owe Itelga? They're our closest neighbour, and a stout ally. If it were us under attack, they would come to our aid immediately. John, if we shirk this duty, what will the rest of the continent think? We'll be ripe for condemnation." John Cade scratched his beard as if mulling the conundrum. "You have a point, old friend, except, call me optimist. But I have no doubt the particulars could be hammered out, especially with the support of an ally like Ithgarod. He is quite impressive, you must agree. Flawed, as all men are, but great." Marcin's mouth hung open, his insides gnarling. He realised in a horrible flash of recognition that his fellow council member, one of the most powerful political forces in the city, had at some point started to idolise the southern tyrant. Another thought tugged at him. Was it true that Asher and Auric were already in support of his agenda? How had their sordid complicity been won? "No, John Cade, you're not well." Enough of the dramatics, please. I've come to speak frankly with you, man to man, statesman to statesman, and explore what it would cost to win your vote. Marson rose from the table, his voice engorged and indignant. I might be a feeble-brained drunk, as you like to spread around town, but I am no traitor to my people. The last thing I would do is sell out our city's legacy to get in bed with an insane sorcerer. At this outburst, John Cade's expression hardened. Out of the corner of his eye, Marson saw his hand, which jittered at the lurch of movement, disappear into the pocket of his pants. It paused there, his forearm becoming taut. What is he doing? Father? A voice squeaked from the stairwell behind the men. Tam, only 7 years old, peered out at the scene. Dressed in white pyjamas, with dishevelled blonde hair reaching down to the small of her back, she was a portrait of sleepy puzzlement. Go back to bed, Tam, Marson instructed. I heard fighting, she replied uncertainly, not budging from the doorway. Apologies for waking you, child. Your father and I were just talking, John Cade reassured her, a disingenuous smile breaking across his face. Friendly banter, that's all. Go, Tam. The girl stared suspiciously at John Cade, who tipped his head in mock cordiality. Reluctantly, and urged by the dismissive hand gesturing of her father, she turned back, receding up the passage to the second floor. This is a surprise, John Cade said in a low voice. I thought Tam was with her mother. Evidently your spies don't know everything, Marson returned disdainfully. There was a change of arrangement. She's with me for the next week. Now I really must insist you leave. The time to discuss Cyril's response to Visican aggression is tomorrow at the scheduled council meeting. You really won't give me a fair hearing, John Cade asked. He sounded oddly resigned. I have nothing else to say tonight. In all of his years of knowing John Cade, of seeing the cracks in the upstanding aristocrat's facade, he never expected the man to exact the sort of brutality that followed. As he tore around the table, his hand coming free from his pocket with a serrated knife, the sort that a fishmonger might brandish, Marson finally saw, all too late, that his colleague was not in his right mind. He stepped back just in time to avoid the force of the weapon's slash, a graze unseaming his upper shirt and skin. John Cade let out a guttural noise, which existed somewhere between a gasp and a groan, and he raised his arm for another strike. Marson, meanwhile, had stepped back again and struck a wall. Unthinkingly, his body tried to crouch out of the engagement, but John Cade was too quick. The blade collided with his chest in a cracking thud. Marson was briefly aware of the air being sucked out of him, of trying to scream for help, but finding there were no words left, of seeing his daughter, whom he loved immeasurably and had failed, lingering wide-eyed at the stairwell. Then the darkness settled over him. His body collapsed to the floor. John Cade held out his blood-coated hands. He had killed before, but never like this, never so personal. He grabbed for the goblet of wine, but knocked it over in his heightened state. Wine as deeply red as the puddle next to Marson, spilled across the table and off the side in a succession of heavy droplets. Shit! Be still, a woman's voice intoned from the depths of his mind. Lavara? He spluttered, recalling the sorceress's name. The girl is upstairs. She saw what you did. John Cade darkened. Aram, save me. To kill a child. Steel your constitution. I would not have you take her life this evening, but you will bring her to me. It was morning when Marson's body was discovered. A vineyard employee arrived shortly after dawn, finding the gate to the property already open. Stranger still, further up the hill, the front door of the residence was agape. He knew then, before he even saw the proctor's body, there had been a home invasion. Earlier conversations now held a terrible prescience. Hadn't the workers often mused on the lightness of the estate's security? How easy it would be to ransack the place if they were so inclined? Though in actuality, most found him too fair and affable an employer to truly entertain such a plot. By noon, several sightings of a burly man fleeing from the vineyard had been recorded with the constabulary. Eyewitnesses were certain he had been carrying something, or someone, in his arms. His colouring was that of a broken islander, they said. A transient worker, most likely, the sort that could easily blend in with the crew of a fishing vessel and be gone in the night. "Good luck to you," a man who had once been on the books of the Valor West Trading Company sniggered. "Proctor Silkwater had enemies, plenty of enemies. I fear you boys are searching for a needle in a haystack." Chapter 5. In the Garden, in the Nest. Nima walked the perimeter of the Lingarda estate for the third time that morning. Boredom in its creeping, lingering way had set in, and not even tending the horses, which were stabled along the eastern wall, could relieve the tedium. Nima was cautious, however, not to moan about the posting. Proctor Lingarda was remunerating them very well, and had extended the warmest of hospitality, even if, after a week, the job had started to feel more like home arrest. No, that isn't fair, she thought. It is a lucky prisoner indeed who has a bath prepared for them in a lavish tub, or is greeted by a banquet-sized breakfast each morning. She petted the 3 horses, one by one, with equal attention, as if to ward off the risk of equine jealousy. Her favourite, although she loved them all, was the horse she rode upon with Caspar, a silver mare she'd named River. "You might as well call it Lady or Moonlight," Leadus had jokingly taunted, taking issue with her conventionality. Nima smiled as she recalled the memory, feeding a handful of grain to River. It was curious how the new Wardens had come to resemble a family unit in such a narrow snatch of time, bickering one moment, rallying each other the next. Her bond was especially strong with Caspar, a fellow Castonian who was close in age and shared her optimism for the world. The Cyrillese twins, Lennox and Letus, were more like older siblings, one considerably snarkier than the other. Both were well educated and enjoyed passing on their knowledge. And then there was Karnek, the enigmatic broken islander who held the crew together with his even temper and practicality, a rich storyteller and a man who, above all, made her feel safe. Nima left the stables and walked on through a small grove of sanguina trees. Between the rustling leaves, flowers shone like pearl baubles. Nima kneeled at the tree's edge, where a row of glorybell bushes had also been planted. She took in the Moorish scent of a yellow, bell-shaped carapace, a blanket of pollen incubated within it, and listened intently to the sounds of Cyril, the warbling of birds in the garden, the heavy dragging of wheels beyond the wall, the harbour's welcoming horns in the distance. There was a time, Nima thought, when she only knew the sounds of Carston, the sandstone metropolis of the east, a city which had endured since ancient times, along with its cousins Cyril and Atalga, even through the formation and dissolution of an empire. She had grown up in a busy district of the city, where places of worship and markets intersected. In quieter moments, she sometimes revisited her memories of ambling through cobbled streets just after dawn, when the merchants set up their stalls, the temple bells sang, and Carston slowly yawned awake. Her upbringing had been somewhat unorthodox. Abandoned like a sack of potatoes gone to seed on the steps of a temple of Azera, she had been raised alongside a motley brood of orphans, many of whom had lost their parents to a particularly vicious outbreak of sickness. Fear ripped through the city at that time. Mottled fever, unconcerned with the economic status, moral standing, or any other facet of its victims, claimed innumerable lives over a 3-year period. Worse still, as the devastation stretched on, a shameful piece of history unfurled itself. The children who were left behind, those lucky enough to be untouched by the plague that claimed their parents, became objects of suspicion, if not fully formed derision, and were even, at the height of the hysteria, ostracized. Father Killiam, a kindly priest of Azera, was a lifeline for children of this ilk, and for Nima too. In the back of the temple, an area which the priesthood once used for administrative purposes, he fashioned a living quarters with enough bunk beds to sleep the discarded children. Unexpectedly, his life's purpose became as much about serving them as it was about serving his beloved goddess. In fact, Nima had once heard him say to an acolyte that he considered Azera his calling, but the children his true vocation. Nima's childhood contained another unique aspect, the discovery of powers which transcended ordinary human limits. In itself, magic was not unusual. There were many who felt a connection to the unseen world, as Letus put it. But her brand of the arcane arts, which centered far more on healing and emboldening the senses, was comparatively rare. People like her were called menders and sought after by the guilds. Father Killiam had witnessed her gift at the same time she'd uncovered it, as a tear-streaked 9-year-old embracing a dog that had been beaten in the alley behind the temple. It was not yet dead, for there were still tiny undulations of breath, but the grisly state of its body indicated that the end was surely imminent. "Nemedora, please, it's a stray. It could be carrying the fever." "Who could do such a barbaric thing, Father?" she'd asked, ignoring him, her wide eyes pleading. "Someone who hates the world, child. Someone who is tired of feeling small, so they chose to be terrible." Nema sniffled, not really wanting to hear his wisdom, his rationalizations. The callousness of the world, of the people in it, disturbed her to the point of despair. Just then she looked down, and her breath suddenly caught in her throat. Her hands, which lay atop the creature's lusterless brown coat, were now glowing a milky white. In addition to the visual display, she felt a dizzying sensation take over, akin to riding a horse in circles too many times. And then a wave of warmth travelled up the length of her body, causing her to tremble with its intensity, though not altogether in an unpleasant way. It was certainly unlike anything else she had experienced. "Nemedora, what ails you?" Killiam exclaimed, tossing an arm around the shivering girl. "Nemedora!" After a few seconds, the light faded and she slumped against the priest, exhaling heavily. "You okay?" "I think so, Father." "Thank Azera. You frightened me, child." Nema would always remember the surge of delight she felt. When looking back down at the mauled animal, she saw a pair of green eyes unsheath themselves and gaze up at her. The dog was disoriented and desperately fatigued, but Nema thought she detected another emotion too. Relief. Somehow, she had rescued the creature from darkness. She would make sense of this for a time by saying that her distress had triggered a miracle, and Father Killiam was slow to correct this misunderstanding. Regardless, it was a formative moment for Nema, one that unknowingly had placed her on a path to meeting Caspar and the rest of the new Wardens. Nema continued her stroll around the perimeter of Lingada Estate. A short distance away, she could see the entry gate and the outlines of Ekkel, the steward, and Caspar, who were locked in conversation. She approached the men. "Good morning," she beamed at them both. However, as the words moved from her lips, she registered the grave expressions they carried. "Oh, is something wrong?" "It's Marson Silkwater, the proctor we met at the water theatre. He's dead." Nema's eyes widened. "Foul play?" "Perhaps," Ekkel replied. "We should be careful not to unduly panic the lady of the house, however." "That might be easier said than done," Caspar frowned, brushing the golden hair out of his eyes. "Paquin's already on edge, and this will just corroborate her fears that something is seriously amiss here." Ekkel nodded. Had served Paquin for a number of years, and knew her better than most, her insecurities and eccentricities, her brilliance and her flaws. The news that her best friend, her closest political ally, had been found deceased would break her, conceivably beyond repair. "We must tell her immediately," he said. They found Paquin in her study. She was bending over her desk, motioning to different points on a map of the continent and its surrounding islands. The scroll was worn with age. Karnik stood next to her, clearly interested in her geographical observations, his mass emphasizing her meekness. "I have visited your homeland only twice," she remarked as Nema, Caspar, and Ekkel entered. "Forgive me for saying so, but the Broken Islands is a somewhat dreary title for an archipelago of such beauty and diversity, don't you think?" Karnik smiled. "Perhaps, but my people do not consider brokenness to be inherently negative. You see, when something breaks, there is the opportunity for it to be reborn, made better than before. I rather like that idea, actually. Though our islands are splintered, we now have the opportunity to come together, more formidable and unbreakable than ever. Of course, there are some who believe we ought to refer to their islands by their ancient name, Arcanesia. My mother is one such advocate. Anything else is an insult to our ancestors, she says." "Arcanesia," Paquin repeated, savouring the word in her mouth. Ekkel cleared his throat. "My apologies for the intrusion, my lady." Paquin turned her head. "Good grief, what now?" Ekkel froze, searching for the words. He had assumed they would come easily. He was ordinarily a proficient orator, but this time they seized up. Paquin continued to watch him, eyebrows raised. Well, it's Proctor Silkwater. He was found in his house this morning. Stabbed to death, I'm afraid to say. The captain of the city guard just came by to deliver the news. My Aram, she breathed, swaying on her feet. They've come for him, just as they'll come for me. Karnak steadied her. Peace, Paquin. Are there any leads, Ickle? Any sightings of what happened? Again, Ickle flinched, but this time Casper filled the pause. They think it happened last night. There are 3 eyewitnesses who saw a man fleeing from the scene, with Marston's daughter in tow, apparently. Damn! No! Paquin gasped. To involve a child is despicable, Karnak said with defiance. Did the man's appearance offer any clues to his motive? They're saying he was a broken islander. Nothing beyond that for now, Casper answered again. Karnak nodded silently, knowing what this meant. There would be plenty of vitriol now, the unavoidable reaction to one of his own being fingered. For weeks there would be talk around the city, whispers of the perils that Cyril had willingly invited to her doorstep with such a liberal immigration policy. It would be poisonous and unbearable, he knew, but it would pass. We must increase our level of vigilance, Karnak instructed Casper and Nima. It's unlikely this development is a coincidence. Rather, it seems to lend credence to the teller's warning. Go, find Letus and Lennox. It's important we fill them in at once. As they left, he addressed Paquin again, who was bracing himself against the desk. I know this is a terrible shock. And I know we've had this conversation previously, but is there anyone you can think of who has a reason to murder proctors? Anyone with a grudge against the council, or someone who stands to gain if you and Marston are removed from it? Paquin shook her head soundlessly. My lady, what about the coming vote? Ickle volunteered. On the Atalga issue. At first she regarded her steward with an air of irritation, but then her expression remoulded itself to something more contemplative. You really suspect that could be related, Ickle? He shrugged. It would be wise to consider all possibilities. Proctor Silkwater and yourself, just recently, spoke unambiguously of the need for Cyril to support Atalga in any conflict stemming from the Southern Warlock's aggression. Sure, but that's hardly a controversial position, she replied. In fact, it's a view shared by most members of the Council. John Cade seems to be the outlier, but I'd expect nothing less from one of his immoral slipperiness. Yet, plausibly, one of Ithgarod's agents could be seeking to make a statement, Karnak added, chewing over Ickle's theory for a moment. It wouldn't be the first time these people have meddled in foreign affairs. The goal might not necessarily be to disrupt the vote, come to think of it. It might be to simply intimidate the Cyrillese public, to say, if you enter a war with me, if you even entertain it, you will be destroyed by any means necessary. Paquin moaned a little and opened the top drawer of her desk. There was a small vial of whiskey which she downed in a single lithe movement. Ickle averted his eyes as this happened, as if to affirm his discretion. On the other hand, Karnak said, lowering his voice, it could just be a deranged member of the public who feels like you taxed him excessively last year. We don't have any conclusive answers. But rest assured, Proctor Lingarda, the new Wardens will ensure your safety, whoever we're dealing with. Thank you, she said, weak-voiced. If you'd excuse me, I need to lie down. I need to reflect on what's happened to my poor friend. I shall fetch you a hot lavender tea, my lady, Ickle said, as dutiful as ever, to sweeten your dreams. Yes, yes, she muttered groggily. A little sleep will help. In the parlour downstairs, Karnak found himself reunited with the others. They were stony-faced and waiting on his command. Okay, Proctor Lingarda may be in mortal danger after all, he started. The deceased is someone she was very close to, a fellow proctor and friend. From this point onward, we must assume the estate is being watched, and may yet come under attack. Lennox hummed with assent. And there's no sense of the motive yet. There is a dim possibility that Ithgarod may have his fingers in it. Proctor Lingarda, after all, is a vocal critic and a person of influence. But this is merely conjecture. It could be anything. We don't have all the pieces yet. Paquin should limit her movements, Casper said, his dual swords visible at his side. We can't protect her out there. Too many narrow streets, too many vantage points and shadowy nooks. I agree. She must not return to the city dome until this matter is resolved. Yet we cannot sit idly on our hands waiting to be ambushed, Letus challenged. That I also agree with, Karnak replied, catching Letus off guard, who had been primed to argue. You and Caspar will go on an excursion, away from the estate. I want you to find out if Proctor Silkwater had any enemies. Ask around at the city dome, at his vineyard. Hell, at the local taverns. They're a hive of gossip, aren't they? Information is power, and at present we have a drought of it. The men exchanged a look and nodded. It was better to chase their tails outside the estate's walls than go mad with boredom inside them. Lennox, Nima, you and I will guard Proctor Lingada with our lives. She's broken and she needs us, so let's not allow a speck of our concentration to erode. I don't need to tell you all. There's darkness afoot. Chapter 6 Sovereign of Night. A small, hunched man, whose name was known throughout the Leechlands, shuffled into the throne room of Castle Kraldin. It was an expansive chamber, something he remembered well from the previous administration. Under Ithgarod's authority, however, the room had lost its natural light, with iron sheets now covering the once grand windows. The meagre light there was emanated from a procession of burning torches, which were vaguely funereal and imbued the room with a stifling, sticky quality. Ahead of him, a voice echoed, Elia Pisano, you honor me with your attendance today. Elia gawked at the ornate throne of midnight black Visican glass. The individual sitting upon it appeared unremarkable to him, not imposing in stature, nor especially handsome. Just a man by any observation. A man, Elia knew, who had ordered and participated in acts of appalling violence. I am afraid you may find my presence today disappointing, Lord Ithgarod. Is that so? There were pews on either side of the throne where the tyrant's senior advisors and military strategists sat in waiting. One of these, a bullish general called Cleavertooth, leered at him, revealing the craggy geometry of teeth that had earned him the nickname. Yes, sir. Assuming my intelligence is correct, and you indeed wish to enlist me in your war. Ithgarod rapped his knuckles on the throne's armrest. Am I to believe a veteran like yourself would rarely turn his back on the kingdom he served for decades? With all due respect, sir, I do not believe that is what I am doing. Then explain, Elia sighed. I am a retired man now, a man who lives a simple, quiet life with his family. My dues to Visica have long been paid. It's time for younger men to rise and carry the flag. A scornful laugh erupted from the pew. Ilya was unsurprised to see that it belonged to Cleavertooth. Oh, I have heard of you, sir, he said, facing down the general with fearless abandon. It's rumoured you take great pleasure in disfiguring women. Is that before or after you force yourself on them, you ignoble pig? Cleavertooth sprung to his feet, armour rattling and eyes blazed with fury. He groped for his curved blade, ready to make an example of the old fool. Enough, Ithgarod intoned. You will take your seat, and Ilya, you will moderate your tongue. My men will not be subject to your uninvited criticisms. Ilya demurred. I apologize for the outburst. Ithgarod stared at the aged soldier, his mind flitting over his next words. He did not wish for the conversation to devolve into argument, yet the war veteran's reluctance confounded and incensed him. He now understood why his first letter of summons had gone unheeded. What must I offer you to secure your naval expertise? Ithgarod demanded, suppressing the brunt of his ire. If I am to take a Telga, it will be by fury of land and sea. There is nothing, sir. I have lived a full and prosperous life. I hunger only for the calm of the countryside now. I'm sorry. Ithgarod considered this for a moment, unimpressed. What about the ruins of Minar? My lord? I don't understand. You are a scholar of Visican history, correct? What better then than to hold dominion over this ancient site? It would be yours to restore, or if that's too onerous, leave untouched. There are many who would pay you well to look upon the ruin of a dead king, to walk its grounds. It is yours if you desire it. I have no need for altars of the past. There was a scatter of murmurs in the pews. Ilya was momentarily speechless. I... He stuttered. I know not what to say. This offer is unexpectedly generous. Good. You will consider my request then. Your answer is needed soon. In the meantime, I would have you stay in the castle as my guest. Yes, all right. But I cannot make any assurances. I will need to correspond with my family. Of course, I will have one of the handmaidens show you to your lodging. Later, as the sun began its downward creep, Ithgarod stood on the outer landing of Castle Kralden and beheld the grey sprawl of Vizika beneath him. His pride had been jabbed at by the old man's reticence, but he willed himself to keep the bigger picture in view. Ilya Pisano would make a fine admiral. Furthermore, his respectability would help to quell some of the concerns, both within the military ranks and civilian populace, that too much was changing, too quickly, and that Ithgarod only promoted his closest loyalists. Cleavertooth, his mind wandered. That imbecile has been complicating matters for me as of late. There is no subtlety with him, just bluster. Though, in fairness to him, I suppose every army needs its beasts. Killers who relish the kill and aren't easily disheartened by the impolite realities of war. These qualities are why I recruited him in the first place. Ithgarod paced for a time, occasionally glancing at the darkening sea which interspersed the swamp plains of the Leechlands. He could see the outline of a dozen warships in waiting at Port Arbalest, which meant another half-dozen patrolling in nearby waters. He scowled, troubled again. It bothered him that the shipbuilding project was proving glacially slow, not to mention an insatiable sinkhole for coin. One thing was certain, however: a robust navy would be essential for the next part of his plan. It would help to keep the island states at bay too, lest they conjure any misguided ideas of heroism. Ithgarod made a mental note. Perhaps Ilya could intercede with the operation, help to quicken the production of ships. The shipbuilders would have an easy choice: heed the call for efficiency from a respected naval veteran, or be fed to the flames. As he was imagining this punishment, a woman's voice surfaced in his mind. My darling, is now a good time? Your timing is excellent, Lavara, he communicated back. I've just stepped up for some air. Good. I'm pleased to hear you're taking time for yourself. As she spoke, he visualized her reclining in front of him, clad in underwear resembling little more than a wisp of smoke. Her silver eyes would be beckoning for him, he thought, beckoning for the coarseness of his touch, and he would dutifully oblige. He was master to no man, and never would be, but Lavara's wiles were difficult to rebuke. Are you sleeping through the night? She inquired. I'd fare better with you at my side. She laughed. That I'm not convinced of. Both had once been residents of the island of Esward and its venerable institution, the Prialoon Academy. Lavara, a more recent deserter, washed up on Ithgarod's doorstep just a few years earlier. She had been but a girl when his expulsion had taken place, that which had earned him the irksome moniker of exile. Her arrival had been followed with a request that he found elegant in its simplicity. Let me serve you, she'd said, and let it be at my full capacity, purely, free of any limitation on my powers. That had, of course, been one of Ithgarod's main gripes with the Academy, back when he was just Thane, a plucky kid with a small yet irrepressible inkling that he was meant for greatness. The Academy hierarchy was dogged in erecting barriers for its magic-wielding pupils, always cautioning, never aggrandizing, and it became clear to Ithgarod, after only a short time, that a culture of fear reigned, a fear, pathetically he thought, of their own majesty. Ultimately, Ithgarod saw it as a failure of imagination as much as guts. They would never accept their role as superiors in the world, because it would mean upsetting the social order, and they were too accustomed to their cage of civility. When Lavara slinked into his world, he was not seeking a romantic entanglement, especially not one of any sort of permanence, but nevertheless, to his surprise, he found her a radiant and irresistible presence. She had other uses beyond merely lightening his mood too. It transpired she was a quick study in the art of war, and she had helped him, along with others, to take the full reins of Vizca's leadership. In fact, it had been her idea to quietly poison the late consul, a man who was aged and ailing anyway, knowing instinctively that a bloodless transfer of power would be better in the long run. And with this plot, there was plausible deniability. It could be posited, then, by those who took notice of such things, that he owed her something of a debt. Fortunately for him, and the longevity of their relationship, she had never been the type to make demands above her station. He hoped it stayed that way. "I'm taking care of matters in Cyril," she purred again in Ithgarod's mind. "Let it not trouble you. Soon their council will be tied up in their own internal strife, and they won't have the numbers to move against you, at least not with any urgency. Ithgarod, their so-called ally, will be adrift at sea. Your talents never cease to please me. And you flatter me too much, my lord. The simple truth is their institutions are just as frail as we expected. When will you take flight to Carsten?" She paused. "Once I am satisfied the wound is deep enough in Cyril, a few more days should see it done." Ithgarod looked over the railing at Vizca below. The citadel wasn't much to look at, washed out like a painting damaged by light. Still, he loved her for enduring through the ravages of time, through the death of empire and the burden of independence, through failed uprisings and long stretches of famine, through the reigns of incompetent kings and mad kings, and kings who didn't go far enough, and always through subjugation from the north. Subjugation which masqueraded shamelessly as beneficence and concern for the continent, but was no less cruel or condescending for it. No, Vizca would be restored to her highest glory, and those other cities, Ithgarod, Carsten, even Cyril, once it was no longer useful, would burn. They would be the ones forced on their knees, forced to reckon with a new order. A sound drew his eyes to the north sky. An ugly bruise of cloud was forming, cracking and rumbling in its centre with ferocious discontent. It seemed to be moving across the Leechlands and into the neighbouring realm. "Go now," Ithgarod whispered, a little eccentrically to the mounting storm. "Go and work your hatred upon my enemies." 5 floors beneath him, in small but well-appointed living quarters, Ilya dipped his quill into a pot of ink and scrawled a note for his wife. "My darling," he wrote, "I expect you will chide me once you have read this letter. You were right, of course, to caution me so vociferously against coming here in the first place. Perhaps you remembered something about myself which I had forgotten over these last few years, of tending the land, of caring for our family, that I am just as open to suggestion and susceptible to temptation as any other man. And I have been tempted, my darling. I fear I do not have the vocabulary to deny such a prize as the ruins of Minar. You will think less of me, no doubt, and tell me so, but I bid you remember one thing. Vizca has been under the boot for too long, condemned for historical mistakes, underpaid for our mineral resources of which the veins run almost dry, and treated with disdain on the very rare occasions when we have swallowed our pride and asked for aid. It seems to me this dam cannot hold. Maybe this sorcerer, Ithgarod, this raiser of Sage Town, this Knight Sovereign as some are calling him, is just another barbarian with delusions of import. Or maybe, just maybe, he is the imperfect force our people need right now. I will reserve this judgment and await your inevitable lashings, my darling. Know that I love you, as I love our children, and as I love this damned kingdom too. Yours in both resignation and hope, Ilya." Chapter 7. The Tempest and the Lightkeepers. Heavy globules of rain had begun to fall on the square. Proctor Asher Emerine tugged nervously on his cuffs as he waited for his colleague, now conspirer, to join him in the tavern which faced the city dome. It was an imposing structure, cathedral-like and well fortified with stone, with a labyrinth of warrens concealed beneath the ground level that had mostly been unused since the earlier periods of political upheaval. Cyril had in fact enjoyed an extensive stretch of peace in Asher's lifetime, disturbed only by minor skirmishes, half-hearted challenges at revolution and the like, but now it felt the city was pressed against the edge of a blade. An elected official was dead. Their closest neighbour, a Telga, was perilously close to all-out war, and rather than advocating for their immediate reinforcement, Asher was instead playing the part of the tentative pragmatist. Let's wait and see what happens. To rush in is to be reactive. Would the city really abide a stance of inaction? No reasonable man wished to be embroiled in war, it was true, lest the benefits were laid out in stark clarity, but regardless there would be some who saw an existential risk if the southern general's power was to be left unchecked. Yet a question beckoned. Was the risk of total destruction really so great? Wars had raged since the infancy of time itself. They were a messy, but on the whole practical method of mediating competing interests. The Visicans were also no faceless horde. Their grievances, their aspirations to hold a higher position in the world, were perfectly understandable. And who's to say Ithgarod wouldn't moderate himself once a Telga, an ample trophy in itself, was under his heel? Asher rubbed his temples. His thoughts were rambling again. Why even delude himself, he thought, into framing this as anything other than self-interest? John Kay didn't bother with such exercises. He heard the elder statesman's voice in his mind, coaxing. Think of a Cyril not with 7 insipid proctors, paper pushers essentially, beholden to bureaucracy, but rather 2 emperors, if you will, with powers expanded, truly befitting of our station. Think of that, my boy, and think too, while we're on the subject, of what lies tantalizingly in the east, what might theoretically be brought into the fold with the right military, and with the right allies. Asher felt prying eyes upon him. He had patronized this tavern before, its closeness to the city dome making it a convenient spot for both casual and clandestine meetups, away from the echoing and invigilated corridors of power, where hearty conversation and the clinking of glass provided a veil of discretion. Now, was he imagining it? He felt a coldness, suspicion in the way the other patrons were regarding him. He wished John Cade would hurry up. As the rain graduated from a spit to a drizzle, John Cade's shape appeared at the top of the city dome's stone steps. He was liaising in a pantomime of vigorous gesticulation with Auric Plant, who they had recruited in their scheme by virtue of a handsome bribe. Auric was thoroughly uncomplicated. Unlike the other proctors, who at least presented the illusion of having a moral core, he was a husk, avaricious and hospitable to all manner of ideas and agendas, just as long as the price was compelling enough. Parting at the bottom of the steps, John Cade jovially slapped him on the back and quickened his advance in Asher's direction. Despite his age and limp, he moved briskly. True to form, he was not the sort of man to be slowed by anything. "By Aram, you look glum," he remarked, taking a seat opposite Asher and brushing off some of the moisture that had collected on his robes. "Problem?" "No, just eager for an update." "Right. Well, as we expected, the Speaker is delaying the debate for a few days, so we as a council, and as a city, may adequately mourn our dear Marson Silkwater." Asher nodded, feeling a tightness in his throat. John Cade patted him encouragingly on the shoulder, apparently sensing his discomfort. "Oh, don't fret, young Asher. All is going to plan. Perhaps things are moving a little faster than we anticipated, but this is a welcome development if anything. We have both known men, haven't we, so paralyzed by their own mediocrity that the total sum of their life's achievements could fit on a 3-inch slip of parchment. But that is not us. We are far greater than a footnote." Asher eyed the gathering rain through the window, watched a family take cover under the awning of a bread stall. Nearby a puddle was forming in a pit of uneven cobblestones. What now of Paquin? While she remains in play, the numbers are not in our favour. It's in hand. My advice is to keep it from your mind tonight. Spend the evening in the embrace of your lovely Clementa. Will she meet the same fate as Silkwater? Asher asked, trying to strip his voice of emotion. While he found the woman pretentious, not to mention off-puttingly feeble as of late, as if sliding into madness before their very eyes, he could not truly will himself to believe she deserved to die. I think that would arouse too much suspicion, John Cade replied, looking altogether pleased with himself. No, the sorceress and I confirmed this morning. There is an obvious solution, one which she has kindly offered to assist with. I think I impressed her with my own show of fidelity to the cause the other night. Excitement leached into his words. This will be the narrative. Ready? Rent by the grief of losing her closest friend, Paquin Lingada, whose erratic behavior had long been noted, finally gave in to hopelessness. Inconsolable in the lonely night, she made the decision to sever her own life. Under a footbridge, Caspar and Letus took refuge from the pounding rain. They were only a few blocks from the Lingada estate, but their clothes were comically soaked. Caspar emptied out a bag of petite, lightly spiced cheese scones, a snack foisted on them by Paquin's steward. As it happened, they were somehow unspoiled by the elements, and made for a delicious morsel, especially as the men had neglected to eat dinner that night, so distracted were they by their objective. Well, it's safe to say today was a bust, Letus said, mouth full. No leads at the vineyard, except for a vague reference to Silkwater being in debt, which is hardly out of the ordinary in this city. Nothing of note at the nearest drinking holes, nothing particularly helpful from Proctor Faircurtain at the City Dome. I suppose it was a long shot, Caspar replied. But at least we had a chance to stretch our legs. I was starting to feel cooped up back at that house. As was I. It's a dust trap, isn't it? All those antique vases lying about, salvaged through time from Aram knows when. The word gaudy doesn't cover it. Caspar laughed, amused in spite of himself by Letus's pettiness. He wondered fleetingly if Karnak had paired them together in the hope they would improve their rapport. It would be just like him to enact such a plot. I can't deny it's nice to be home, Letus continued, striking a more serious note. He let out a relaxed sigh as he leaned against the brick. Nearby in the canal, a small rowboat strained against a cable. Its red paint had peeled off in places, leaving behind long lacerations. Cyril sure is beautiful, wild weather aside, Caspar said. By the way, are your parents here? Do you want to visit them before we return? Nah, they live in Esward now, he answered, and then added proudly. My mother tends the Academy Library. She oversees thousands upon thousands of books, actually. A sizable portion of the world's knowledge. He smiled wickedly. Do they have books in Carston? Caspar, with a look of mock insult on his face, prodded him in the stomach, and they scuffled for a moment before collapsing into giddy laughter. You're insufferable sometimes. You do know that, right? Caspar grinned. Around them, the sky continued to fall, loud and unrelenting, and a flash of lightning briefly illuminated what looked like a hooded figure, heading in the direction of the estate. Paquin felt a presence in her bedroom. She felt it even before she heard the unmistakable creak of a person shifting their weight on the wooden floor. Alarmed, she propped herself up on her elbows. Who's there? She croaked, straining to make out anything in the darkness of her bedroom. As her sight adjusted, she saw there was indeed something, a shape, teetering in the corner. Did her eyes deceive her? It appeared to have the proportions of a porcelain doll, only slightly larger, with a shock of hair cascading down its front. Miss Paquin? The girl spoke in a tremulous voice. Tam? Is that you? Paquin returned, not fully awake and not fully comprehending what was happening. The girl inched a little closer, enough so that the moonlight which flowed in from the picture window illuminated the innocence of her bruised face. She was in her pyjamas, saturated from the storm. Oh, child, where have you been? With father, she whispered. He's downstairs now, and he's frightened. A bad man tried to kill us. Will you please come down? We need your help. Before Paquin could respond, Tam turned and left the room. There was something unnerving about the way she moved, not wholly human. Brushing along the floor, her steps were indistinct, a slither. Paquin knew there was something terribly wrong. How could she not? Still, she tucked her feet into a pair of slippers and began to follow. Where is Karnik? She thought, mind racing. She remembered he had insisted on sleeping in the parlour downstairs. Was he already awake, alert to the strange happenings? Or was he sleeping soundly, cocooned in ignorance by the thunder patter of the rain? Paquin stepped onto the landing of the second floor. As far as she could ascertain, the house was silent. Tam was a few paces in front of her, fiddling with something on the banister. Again, Paquin strained to make sense of what she was seeing in the dark. Tam, what's happening? I'm frightened. The child turned. There was something in her hand. It was thin and curved, not immediately discernible. Tam, she pleaded again. Her heart was beating vehemently in her chest. It was then, in a moment of grotesque lucidity, as lightning filled the bowels of the house, that Paquin understood the very danger she was in. In the child's hand was a rope, fashioned in the form of a noose, and she had tied it to the railing at the top of the stairs. The girl now spoke, a demented whistle escaping from her lips.
Come, Miss Paquin. My father wants you to join him.
She lurched forward, impossibly fast, and Paquin screamed, cowering backwards to the floor. She assumed she would die then, fulfilling the teller's prophecy, condemned to the grave with little understanding of why. But it was not so. Lennox, who had been listening at the doorway of the next room, unleashed an arrow, and then another, directly into the girl's jugular. She tumbled back, howling and writhing in an ecstasy of pain. Paquin made the mistake of opening her eyes at that precise moment, and witnessed in agonizing slowness a unique horror. A spider the size of a small dog tore itself free from the child's mouth. Once liberated, it thrashed about in a confusion of limbs before quickly righting itself and scurrying down the corridor out of view. Lennox grabbed Paquin hard and urgently. We have to leave, right now. The women fled down the stairs, Paquin in a daze, just as Karnik entered the parlour ahead of them, an oil lamp in his right hand. I thought I heard something in the garden, he barked. What in Aram's name is going on? I've just dispatched a creature on the second floor, Lennox answered, panting, her forehead creased. It's worse than we expected, Karnik. We're dealing with foul magic. There was no time for this to sink in, for the nearby windows suddenly caved. A gale of glass struck the three of them, causing them to cry out and recoil. Paquin was blinded, warm blood streaming down her cheeks. The first to recover was Karnik. Drawing his axe and shielding the women, he faced the source of the disturbance head-on. Lavara, wrapped in a moss-green cloak, hopped through the recess of the window. He had never met the sorceress, though he was familiar enough with the rumours. In the flesh she was undeniably beautiful, like an exotic and dangerous animal. Her silver eyes were as vibrant as an owl's, but there was no love nor tenderness there. Her countenance was adamantine. The hour is late, she said, and for you there is no escape, but death. Karnik stared her down with all the determination he could muster. Fear would not serve him, so he repressed it, thinking only of his next action. Gripping his axe in two hands, he took in a single deep breath and launched himself at the sorceress. Chapter 8. Breaking of the Chain. Caspar rushed through the mud, short swords at his side, as he and Letus heard, then saw, the struggle ensuing in Paquin's manor. Through a paneless window on the first floor, he spied a woman who he did not recognize. With mesmerizing grace, she danced out of the way of Karnik's axe, which bored through the wall, and then unloaded a bolt of lightning at his chest. The blast propelled him out of view, a horrible groan flooding into the night. Lennox, meanwhile, sent a volley of arrows in Lavara's direction. These the sorceress also managed to avoid, except for the final projectile which grazed her hip. She gritted her teeth, swallowing the pain. Caspar reached the door, shoving his key in and pushing it open. In his peripheral vision he caught another flying fork of energy. Lennox evaded this missile in a nimble flourish, taking cover behind the settee where Paquin was hiding, still clutching her bloodied face. She frantically readied her bow for another offensive. It was a scene of utter carnage. Casper sprinted forward, attempting to cut at the witch with his twin swords. Lavara shrugged off this advance, inheriting only a couple of minor abrasions, then repelled him with a forceful gust that sent him spiralling towards Karnik's body. Winded, he attempted to stand, but faltered. Lavara laughed with whip-sharp menace. "Enough!" Letus yelled, standing with his fists balled at his side. "I know who you are, and I know the sort of company you keep. You're a scourge, a wretch who spits in the face of all of us who choose to wield magic with restraint."
Restraint,
she hissed.
What a pitiable wee man you are. It is you who are the disgrace to our kind. Be gone!
Infused with hate, a tempest of wind and lightning exploded in the parlour. Everything was displaced in the mighty vortex, including the piece of furniture that Lennox and Paquin were using as a barricade. With the room in a new state of disarray, Lavara seized the opportunity and strode towards the battered proctor. Yet something interfered, stopping her in her tracks. Her mind, which had been oddly placid and methodical until then, suddenly filled with a cacophony of high-pitched sound. She clawed at her head, overwhelmed by the hideous wail which threatened to shatter her skull. Nima was halfway down the stairs. Her hands were upturned, and she was enveloped by an aura of fiercely bright light. With impeccable timing, she was demonstrating what Casper playfully called her party trick, though the power was infinitely more vital than that. It was the reason, beyond her healing faculties, that she was such an asset to the new Wardens. Lavara squirmed on the floor, temporarily disarmed and energy sapped. "Good girl, Nima," Karnik said as he staggered to his feet unsteadily, coughing. "Keep a tight hold of her." Lavara's last torrent of energy had inadvertently roused him back to consciousness. His chest was now exposed, the armoured padding burned away to reveal a gash of blackened flesh. He was lucky to be alive. The others, battling with varying levels of fatigue and pain, collected themselves, brushing off the rubble, and joining Karnik in front of Lavara. Only Paquin remained on the ground, curled up at a safer distance. Mercifully, she discovered that her vision had not entirely deserted her. She could still see out of one eye, though the image that greeted her was hardly a sweet sight. Her house, her painstakingly curated trinkets and antiques, were a wreck. "We have to kill her, Karnik," Letus said, his eyes darting from the sorceress to his leader. Karnik bit his lip, thinking. "Why does Ithgarod want the proctor dead?" he demanded. Lavara ignored him, her body contorting with discomfort, a worm marooned on a stretch of pavement. "I say again," he raised his voice, anger flushing his cheeks. "What's the point of all of this? Why meddle in a city many, many leagues away from Visualiser?" She slumped forward and her black hair spilled onto her derisive face.
"There is no place my lord cannot reach,"
she uttered contemptuously. Lennox aimed her bow at the woman, untrusting, while Casper shuffled restlessly on his feet. Behind them, Nima squeezed her eyes in the growing effort of maintaining her magical grip. She had never faced a foe like this before. Her hands shook, the aura flickering. "What else is he planning?" Karnik interrogated her again. "Tell us, and we will not prolong your suffering." Lavara squinted, a bemused expression coming over her.
"I will tell you nothing,"
she growled as Nima let out a gentle moan.
"Except this, and listen well. You will soon be blasted from this mortal plane. You and everyone else who stands against my king. This is just the beginning."
Karnik lifted his axe, realizing at last the folly of negotiating with such a single-minded creature. Unfortunately, his vengeance came a moment too late. With a surge of concentration, Lavara suddenly unshackled herself from Nima's spell and immediately discharged a white-hot squall at her captors, shunting them off balance. Lennox reflexively fired her arrow, but the angle was off-kilter and it whizzed headlong into the night. Lavara then plunged through the cavity of the window, determined to escape and to live. "No!" Letus shouted. He pursued her then, across the lawn of the Lingada estate, the rain still bucketing, his steps driven by visceral antagonism for this woman who was sullying the name of magic users everywhere. There was a chorus of objection behind him, one of the voices belonging to his sister, but he ignored the sound. He felt in a dizzying rush there was a poetry and inevitability in him being the one to topple her, the noble caster pitted against the wayward sorceress, and in the arena of his home city, no less. Lavara scurried ahead of him through the grove, clumsy movements betraying her diminished state. The sight emboldened him. Closing the distance, he opened a channel of magic and began to summon a spire of ice as sharp as glass. That which he trusted would deliver her to death. "Lavara!" Letus roared. "I have a gift, you bitch!" With all the zeal he could marshal, he sent the frozen spear hurtling in the direction of her head. Lavara turned. Where he expected to see fear, he instead saw her familiar sheen of malice. He realized, dreadfully, the immensity of her resilience. She raised a hand, rerouting the weapon. In midair, it spun back around, then catapulted towards him with a speed that presented no opportunity for deflection. He fell to his knees, mouth slightly ajar, eyes glassy with tears. He had been impaled through the heart. They found his body seconds later. Karnak cradled him in the rain, cursing the boy's recklessness, though really cursing himself for allowing Lavara to steal back the upper hand. Nima, who was already spent, tried desperately to pull him from the darkness with her healing magic, but it was soon apparent that nothing could be done. Lennox stood nearby, swaying a little on her feet, a forlorn expression plastered on her face. It was Caspar, eventually, who placed an arm around her and guided her back inside the manor, where he dried her with a towel and whispered more than once how sorry he was. The city guard arrived after that, their slowness in reacting to the commotion bordering on absurd. The captain, at least, was a man of professional demeanour. He canvassed each of them, took stock of the destruction, arranged for Paquin to be transported to the infirmary, and made a series of assurances that they would swiftly locate Lavara, bringing her to justice. Karnak shook his head, sadly. "No, you won't. She'll disappear now." He walked to the main gate, which was open to the weaving Cyrillese streets. Now that the rain was easing, a crowd of curious onlookers had gathered. In a sympathetic gesture, some of them carried candles. Tomorrow will be a day for picking up the pieces, he thought, leaning against the wall of the estate, for figuring out what in Aram's name we do now. He felt intuitively that their role in things had shifted. How could they simply return to their mercenary life? No. They had been drawn into Ithgarod's machinations for a greater purpose. He was certain of it. He was certain of something else, too. The new Wardens could not remain in Cyril. Whether they had truly thwarted Ogmeda's prophecy, or if Paquin's fate had simply been deferred, he could not say, but it did not change the reality of the situation. They needed to share what they'd learned with a wider audience. An audience with power and resources and the best intentions of the continent in mind. And to be sure they would listen, this needed to be in person. Karnak closed his eyes, now feeling the effects of the herbal sedative had been prescribed for his chest wound. He was tremendously weary, in all ways. A breeze brushed past his face. It was soft and unthreatening, the sort that usually followed a storm. Chapter 9. The White Rock. The Duchess of Itelga, Roma de Nobilis, lingered at her dressing mirror and inspected the curvature of her body. It was obvious now, to anyone with a fraction of wit, that she was swollen with child. She smoothed her hand over the bump, delighting in the way she wore the pregnancy. She even thought her skin looked glossier. "I only wish, my baby, that you were coming into a world free of strife," she said to her reflection, brushing back her chestnut curls. Roma changed into a dress of orange silk, one tailored to flatter her changing body, and she headed to the courtyard of her palace, where she had arranged to meet two of her closest advisors. It was a tranquil area, lined with flower patches and fruit-bearing trees, with a large fountain at its centre that trickled in calming regularity. Along the palace walls, feathered jewels had been planted in abundance. Ferns of deep blue with shiny silver undersides, the official plant of Ithgarod. Fortunately, the landscaping had not been too disfigured by the passing storm. As she sauntered across the courtyard, various attendants, palace guards, and gardeners bowed their heads in deferential greeting. To each of them she offered a clipped smile, pleasant enough, but impersonal. There was a pavilion up ahead, and two men were perched in animated conversation. One was Magwild, her longest-serving advisor, whose remit these days extended to all aspects of Ithgarrod's affairs, a man who'd built up enough trust with Roma over the years that he could now speak his mind. The other, a younger man in his mid-twenties, clad in silver armor with the city's characteristic yellow trim, was Lysith Perengul. Not only was he the captain of Roma's elite guard, the Noblessar, and the man now tasked with firming up Ithgarrod's defences, but he was also, complicatedly, her lover. "Duchess, good morning," Magwild exclaimed, hopping to his feet with a frog-like physicality. "Hello, Mag. Lysith?" "Duchess," the young captain said, taking her hands in a gesture that felt both formal and intimate. She prickled with desire at his touch. "Any news of our spy in Visualiser?" "No, my lady," Magwild replied. "Yet another of my letters has gone unanswered. By the day I grow more and more sure that his cover has been sprung." "I'm afraid I share your conclusion. The risk was considerable, and he understood it well. Nevertheless, a regrettable loss. I shan't enjoy breaking the news to his sweet wife. Any other developments?" "Yes, actually. A letter arrived from Carsten this morn." She exchanged a look with Lysith, a wordless scoff that seemed to say, "Oh, this ought to be good." "They have dispatched 100 soldiers to join our cause, with a pledge of more to come. 50 knights, 30 archers, 20 spearmen." "Thank Azera. Between this and Cyril's platitudes we're saved," she retorted dryly. 100 men. Scoundrels. Lysith scratched his chin. "Duchess, if I may?" "Go on." "Remember when Ithgarod first came to power? One of the first things he did, controversially, was release a score of prisoners. If you recall, he gave them a prerogative. Forget rotting in jail where you're no good to anybody, fighting your useless wars over food and contraband liquor. Serve me instead, and be free. If you're insubordinate or unruly, naturally you'll be put to the sword, but for those with enough sense to grasp this opportunity, to honour it, you will have a second chance at life." He was so fond of his own voice, Roma recognised, though it didn't dull her love for him. She actually found his overconfidence endearing, most of the time at least, even if it did place him in conflict with the older, more cautious militarians. "I'm not saying it's a perfect solution," he spoke again, sounding indignant, "but such an approach would immediately bolster our standing army." "Lad, the Ithgards are already spooked," Magwild haughtily replied. "Unleashing a swarm of murderers on the city will not help matters, I assure you." "I agree with Mag," Roma added, watching the tide of disappointment come in on Lysith's face. "Ithgarod's courting of the unsavoury will prove a great miscalculation in time. Let us instead continue to appeal for assistance, and train as many of our free, able-bodied citizens as we can." Lysith looked down at his gauntlets and fidgeted with them, his pride scathed. Roma saw this and had the wild urge, heightened perhaps by pregnancy, to embrace him, pressing her body unabashedly against his own and breathing in his ear all of the ways he impressed her. She resisted. "On the other hand, I have considered your idea of the body double," she continued, steadying herself. "I agree it's a prudent measure. If Ithgarrod's walls are breached, which they will not be, let's be clear, I do not intend to allow Ithgarod or his wolves to capture me." Unconsciously, she cupped her stomach. There's too much to live for, after all. Magwild nodded. "Quite true, Duchess, quite true. Of course, it is as you say. The White Rock will not fall." He omitted to mention the odd dream he'd been having lately. In the recurring vision, he beheld Ithgarod under a sky of crimson hue, its streets choked with dark plumes, and a man eclipsed in flame, a golem, ripped towards him in the palace square. There was no mouth, at least not one he could discern, but all the same a hateful laugh bayed out of the monster. Even within the fantasy of dreams, it was a sound capable of stripping all the joy and goodness from the world, a sound which, paradoxically given the imagery of fire, set his bones on ice. No, there was no cause to share such a treasonous dream. Some things were better left unspoken. Itelga was a city that knew how to catch the light. Spreading out in whitewashed splendor, its urban geography was a hilly unfurling of luminous teeth. Alleyways paved with mosaics of resplendent color meandered up into different neighborhoods, and it was impossible to walk for any lengthened period without stumbling across a handsome flower bed. Lysith trudged up one such alleyway to a residence he visited often. There was a woman in the garden, hanging out washing on a clothesline strung between two sanguina trees. When she bent over to retrieve a damp blouse from the basket, he whistled boredly at her. Oh, there he is, the dreamy captain of the Noblessar, Nadia responded, flopping into an exaggerated curtsy. Don't forget the terribly brave and wise defender of the city. That remains to be seen. He pulled her into his arms, planting a kiss on her full lips. She enjoyed his rugged beauty at close quarters, his dried bouquet of shaggy, off-blonde hair, the spike of stubble. She supposed the Duchess noticed these attributes too, all the nights they spent together. Jealousy, which was a frequent visitor, rapped at her door once more. The feeling had not quite abated an hour later, when they collapsed on a set of crisp white bedsheets, sweaty and satiated. Nadia nuzzled into him a little needily and traced her finger along his collarbone. Though she feigned repose, her mind had begun to swirl. You know, she ventured, the city is abuzz with speculation over who bedded the Duchess, and more to the point, who finally persuaded their seed to take root within her. Lysith reacted to her choice of language with a half-amused, half-disgusted expression. Must we discuss this now? He laughed. Can't we just lie here, reveling in each other's company? She sat up on her elbows, still trying to strike a casual tone. I'm just saying, people talk. They'll talk about anything to keep their minds off the coming shit, and I've heard your name mentioned a few times now. Creepy magwilds, too, though we must assume this was meant in jest. Lysith cringed a little, then reassured her. It bothers you, I know. I am sorry. Just try to keep the end goal in view, okay? This child will bond us to power, Nadia. Captains come and go. We're all aware of how changeable Rome's temperament is. But a blood connection ensures us. It ensures you, she corrected. Us, he insisted. We're a team. Always will be. He recalled Roma's triumphant face when she first shared the news with him. She'd summoned him to the palace temple where they could be alone, except for the imposing altar, a silent witness of stone. How miraculous, she'd whispered to him earnestly, when I thought my body incapable of nurturing a babe. Lysith quickly masked his panic. The affair had started out of, what? Ambition, certainly, but curiosity too. Boredom, even? Now the situation was transfiguring into something much more serious. Serious, but also profitable. Their alliance in the Pillows had already yielded pleasing results. His elevation to the captainship of the Noblessar, a singular achievement for one of his age. Who knew how high a star could rise now? Roma too demanded little in return. Self-conscious of their 15-year gap, she was reluctant to flaunt their affections in public. Furthermore, any notion of marriage was tabled for the near future. There was, after all, a consuming and expensive war to be won first. The signs were pointing in that direction anyway. Only after this threat was dismantled could one's mind reasonably turn to festivity. This brought Lysith some time. Nadia stood up from the bed and moved to the window, wrapping her naked frame in a quilt. She watched a grey cat pounce from one roof to another, its spry elegance punctuated with a thud. A morbid thought crept over her. You know, my love, perhaps worrying about all of this is unnecessary. It's quite possible we'll all be dead soon. She looked back at Lysith and smirked, the comment apparently facetious, a product of her mischievous sense of humour. Yet something in her delivery did not wholly persuade him. Oh, I don't think so, he replied, trying to keep things light. Personally, I find it difficult to believe Ithgarod would be foolish enough to attack such a well-defended city, with a military as formidable as ours, and the whole continent's eyes upon him. We're no paddock in a valley. We're not Sagetown. He paused, mind ticking over. Of course, if he is as insane as they say, we'll have a few nasty surprises waiting. Lysith thought of his visit to the apothecary's 2 days earlier. They had been working on a special recipe for him, poison that could be applied to the tips of arrows, turning a flesh wound into sure death. Ever since, he had fantasized about being the one to land the killing blow on Ithgarod. It was plausible, should the circumstances present themselves and the venom strike true. He imagined looming over the shrinking sorcerer and pulling back his longsword with a hero's poise. Behind him, a wall of rapturous cheers sounding from the other knights. He'd extend the moment, he decided, just as far as was practical, and savour the ritual of annihilation. Lysith's mind returned to Nadia. "Enough talk now. Get back to bed," he commanded her, renewed with enthusiasm. He knew the tone aroused her. "I am not done with you yet." Chapter 10. Sea of Dreams and Nightmares. Caspar watched the thousand-bridged city gradually shrivel away as they sailed out of Jordica Bay and into the choppy wilderness of the Matron Sea. At the stern of the ship he loitered with a bittersweet feeling. On one hand, it was a relief to be bidding farewell to the location of his near death, an experience that would sour anyone's perception of a place, regardless of how lovely its architecture was. But on the other hand, it meant parting with someone who he genuinely admired. Lennox had resolved, quite legitimately, not to accompany the new Wardens to the island of Esward, though she fully supported their objective. Instead, her plan was to travel southward to Atelga and lend her strength to the front line. She was fervent in this decision. "I must avenge my brother," she'd said at the dock, voice even and immovable. "If I fell even a single Vizican, it will be worth it." She was engulfed in Karnik's massive arms. "We'll miss you, kid, but we're proud of you, by Aram." And so, with the group divided further, days of sailing now awaited the leftover new Wardens. Their vessel was a dashing brig called the Noonriser, so named as a reference to a notorious past crew. Partial to liquor, and plenty of it, they imbibed and brawled and routinely slept in, neglecting their morning duties. Even the captain, it was said, was a willing accomplice in the debauchery. Times had changed now that the vessel had been brought under the ownership of the Lingard family. Greater oversight meant a new era of professionalism, and the name endured only as a tongue-in-cheek tribute. The Noonriser was staffed by about 20 crew, men and women of varying ages who fulfilled the duties of navigators, riggers, carpenters, and humble squabbies. There was also a cook who kept to himself. "Best not to make direct eye contact," one of the riggers had warned Caspar on the first day, and a quartermaster who marched around with an anxious, unyielding temper. Also, in a surprising turn of events, Paquin had not only supplied them with the use of her family's ship, but she had insisted on coming along herself, offering to take up the captain's helm. Her presence as an elected official, she pointed out, would undoubtedly enhance their credibility with the leaders of Esward. What Paquin failed to mention was that the spectre of Ogmeda's prophecy still hung heavily over her, especially while she left herself exposed in Cyril. And incidentally, Eccle's restoration of the manor would drag on for a fortnight at least. In other words, it seemed the pertinent time for a trip abroad. The city dome was accommodating of this leave of absence, sympathetic to the misfortune that had recently befallen her. John Cade had even sent flowers, with a note signed by all the proctors, which ended, "Sending love and vigour to one of the finest public servants Cyril has ever known." As she read each of their names, Luke Hyde, Asher, Abe, Auric, John Cade, she just hoped she had left Cyril in safe enough hands for the near future. Thankfully there were still 4 others to dilute Proctor Bastinian's poison. Caspar craned his neck, spotting Paquin on the forecastle with Karnik. The attack had left her one eye short, and thus more than ever she looked the part of the weathered sea dog with her eye patch. Yet, cosmetic change aside, her life was intact. The new Wardens had succeeded that far, even if the assault on her estate presented more questions than it answered. Caspar pushed Lavara from his mind. She had wrought enough sorrow from him. He was determined to relish his trip over open sea while it lasted, something which he had enjoyed in his boyhood on smaller boats off the coast of Carston. Over the next few days he ingratiated himself with the crew, a band of Cyrillese natives who were rough-edged and likeable. Though their intake of grog was closely regulated, gambling flourished, mostly in the form of a card game called Rabbit. Casper joined a stalwart group each night in the cargo hold. Here, in a dusty corner smelling of cured meats, they huddled around a small table in the lamplight, cracking jokes and telling increasingly outlandish stories, while bundles of mirror exchanged hands with the ebb and flow of luck. One of these avid gamblers, the bosun of the ship, Benny, had taken an immediate shine to Casper. At first this materialized only as cheeky comments, lobbed his way while he assisted on deck. Her interest became more overt, however, when on one particular evening, pockets lined and feeling faintly woozy from the rationed liquor, she leaned over and tousled his golden hair. Overseeing this, one of the riggers whistled and exclaimed, "Oh, watch out, Cass, I think she likes you." "Oh, shut your trap," Benny laughed, kicking the man into the table. "Don't mind his nonsense. Although I will actually admit, it's been a long time since we've had someone of such fine bone structure aboard the Noonriser. Makes a nice change from staring at you, sagging louts." The others, all men, howled at her brazen flirtation. "You're shameless, Benny," one of them cried out, with another adding, "Keep it in your pants, boss." Casper placed another bet down on the table, his way of politely demurring, and the game of Rabbit gradually recommenced in its usual vein. Flurries of activity intermixed with long pauses for meandering anecdotes. Benny was quieter than before, disappointed perhaps that her advance had not been reciprocated, but she ploughed on with the game nonetheless, and her luck remained strong. In one of the intermissions, a familiar name surfaced in conversation. John Cade Bastinian, proctor and owner of the Valor West Shipping Company. Casper's ears pricked up. "That man is the slimiest bastard you'll ever meet," the carpenter said. He'd previously worked on one of his trading vessels. "He's the sort who'll take any job, legality be damned. Heck, he'd restart the slave trade if he didn't think he'd get caught straight away. How that man came to be a moral leader of our city, like our Lady Paquin, I'll never know." "Isn't he the one that received a slap on the wrist for peddling human skulls? Taken from street urchins that had fallen sick with the fever?" someone asked. "Yep, and that ain't the worst of it," the carpenter replied, hanging his head. "I'll be damned if I ever work for that man again." Later, as the last of the candles had been extinguished and Casper readied himself for bed, Benny approached him at the berths. She wore a sheepish expression, just discernible in the dark. Look, I'm sorry about earlier. I can get a little carried away sometimes." "No need to apologize, really," he smiled, pressing affectionately on her elbow. "Besides," she continued, fidgeting with her ponytail, "I know you really have eyes for... Nima, is it? Hard to compete with such a refined, high-born lady. She's so pretty we could mount her as a figurehead on the front of the ship." Casper shook his head. "Nima's much more like a sister. No romantic connection there, I assure you." "She's not highborn either, by the way. She grew up in a temple orphanage." "Really?" "Yeah. She's led an interesting life, to say the least." "So now I'm confused. What is your type? Dolphins?" He laughed a tad awkwardly. "Well..." His eyes flitted, in a deliberate gesture, to the nearby row of men's hammocks. The night's orchestra of snoring had begun, starting with a discordant overture. While not his usual fare, the dozing sailors nevertheless illustrated his point. "Oh," Benny squeaked in recognition. Then, startling Casper, she let out a snort of laughter. "Oh, I see. You know, that actually makes me feel a lot better. I was worried I'd become some terribly undesirable sea witch." "Certainly not," Casper chuckled. "You're a catch, Benny." After he'd wished her good night, a final giggle trailing in her wake, he hopped up in his hammock and lay on his back, listening to the slow groaning of the ship. It was loud enough to rise above the men's vibrato, and more melodic by far. Above him he could also hear a scatter of footsteps from the night watch. The Noonriser gently listed from side to side, moving in rhythm with the all-powerful matron sea. Soon enough, like an infant from simpler times, he was rocked to sleep. Shortly after midnight, Nima was roused from her dreams. She had been walking the haphazardly paved streets of Carston, caught up in a crowd of strangers. As she ventured on through corridors of sandstone, she found that her usual route of travel did not lead her home to the Temple of Azera, but instead to a large clearing where a gathering of beggars reclined on the hard ground. She approached one of them, a woman, and asked, "Excuse me, ma'am, do you know where the temple that once stood here has gone?" Her head was wrapped in a woolen shawl, and when she looked up, Nima was surprised to see her countenance was not in the least bit sunken or wan. In fact, it was a face she knew, one wreathed in malignance. "Lavara!" she gasped. Nema woke with gems of sweat on her brow, her chest rising and falling with short, shallow breaths. She sat up, peeled back the scratchy blanket, and tried to compose herself. "You okay?" Benny whispered from the adjacent berth, half asleep. "Oh, I just had a silly nightmare. Sorry for waking you. I'm heading up for some fresh air." Benny mumbled something inaudible in return. The night was chillier than Nema expected, and she immediately regretted coming up to the top deck barefoot. Wind strained against the sails, causing them to whip back in loud protestation, and overhead the full moon, Emperor of Night, glistened in perfect spherical smoothness, at least to Nema's naked eye. She took up position near the bowsprit. Lavara's visits to the realm within sleep were infrequent, but painful. Nema often dreamed of her home city, Karsten, so the sorceress's presence there felt like a violation, and although her appearances were presumably the stuff of fantasy, and of an overactive mind, they left in their wake a terrible residue of guilt. Nema knew logically that she ought not to carry the blame of Ledis's demise. Lennox herself had reiterated this several times, the last of which was on the docks just before they embarked. But all the same, a simple truth assailed her. She was the one who had failed to keep Lavara ensnared. Nema was watching the water, illuminated by the generosity of the moonlight, when she felt the ship shudder in an exaggerated manner, as if thrusted off balance by an earthquake, though on the open water this could not be the case. Frighteningly, she observed a giant shadow take shape beneath the vessel. It was immense in scale, totally eclipsing their hull, with water fissuring at its edges. Nema's lips parted, a moment away from raising the alarm, but then she heard a voice behind her, and the calmness of its intonation stilled her. "The Broken Islanders call him O Azul," the man said. "He was one of the riggers, awake on night watch. For hundreds of years he has inhabited these waters, guiding the ships. It is a good omen to see him up close. I am assured of our safe passage to Isward now." "How incredible," Nema answered. "That's the matron sea. She holds no end of secrets." Nema leaned back over the side and watched the mysterious creature, its outline, complete the sweep, before rejoining the anonymity of the depths. The encounter had lasted only a few minutes, enough time for her feet to go numb with the cold, but Nema did not care. She was shaken with wonder by what she had witnessed. Nature was a marvel. The homicidal sorceress did not trouble her mind again that night. She was too fixed on what lurked miles beneath the noon riser, the enormity of it, and the grace. It was another 3 days before the island of Isward appeared ahead of them, a verdant ridge on the horizon. The morning was temperate, with a favourable wind ushering them in. "I can't thank you enough for your assistance," Karnak said, idling with Paquin on the deck. He cupped a bowl of warm fish soup in his hands, one of the cook's specialities. "You have delivered us here much faster than we would have otherwise managed." "It was my pleasure," she replied. "In fact, after all we've been through, I dare say it was my duty. I just pray the Iswardians will heed our call for action. They are so accustomed to their posture of neutrality, of cool detachment." Swigging the last of the salty broth, Karnak lifted a spyglass to his eye and surveyed the distant landmass. As far as islands went, it seemed run-of-the-mill, not unlike those which lay further north than his home archipelago. A pier, like a slender index finger, jutted outward in welcome, and beyond it there was a pebbled shore and the beginning of dense, richly green forest. It was an inviting entry point, perfectly non-threatening at a glance, but Karnak knew this was all part of the illusion. Isward, after all, was the cradle of some of the most powerful sorcerers the continent had ever known. Ithgarod himself had sharpened his claws in its academy. It was no ordinary rock in the middle of the ocean. I share in your trepidation," he said. "Yet here is an important truth which I learned several years ago. The Iswardians care much more about the continent's stability than they let on. While they may feign impartiality and foster an attitude of absolute independence, they are, in fact, always closely observing the happenings of the realm and debating how best to secure their interests. They plot and they meddle, just like any other state." Paquin was keenly listening. "I do not doubt you are correct. It would be supremely short-sighted of them to disregard the politics of the continent when it affects us all. especially when it was their institution that equipped Ithgarod with the knowledge and tools to harness his wickedness. But tell me, how is it you came to know so much about their activities? Karnik glanced around to make sure no one was eavesdropping, then answered in a more discreet voice. Because they are the ones who founded the new Wardens in the first place. And why would they establish a mercenary guild with multiple chapters existing primarily to help people on the mainland if they felt fully divorced from it? Goodness, I had no idea, Pequin said, astonished. But hang on, that makes little sense. Perhaps not, unless you come to the conclusion, as I have, that there is a greater scheme at work. What it is, I can only theorize, but I intend to question them on the subject once we arrive. Then I will entreat them with every bone of persuasion in my body to commit their wisdom and power to resisting this evil that now imperils us. I am confident they will not stoop to hiding in their towers and their libraries, eyes averted, while Atalga and the rest of the continent burns. The noonriser glided forward, drawing closer to the island. Urged on by the wind, sails flapping with great force, there was something intangible yet inspiriting in the air. Caspar felt it, high upon the mast platform, and Nima felt it at the bow. It was something like hope. Chapter 11. Hall of Remnants. They had not forewarned Isward of their arrival, but all the same a representative of the island stood in waiting as they anchored their ship in the bay and came to shore in a tiny armada of rowboats. It was Karnik's idea to take this precaution. He'd heard of bigger vessels getting beached after the tide inexplicably receded beyond its usual bounds. Though it was unlikely the Iswardians would conceive any reason to trap them, even if their discussions soured, Karnik nevertheless heeded a call from within. "Keep your eyes wide open, pilgrim," the voice said. "Expect anything." After all, Isward had known of Ithgarod's hunger for brutality when he had assumed the Vizcan leadership, but they'd remained as silent as gargoyles. Why? The question endured. Was there a chance, however minute, that in the years since his exile from their shores, they had actually softened in their opposition to him? Time bestowed wisdom, but it could also muddle the mind. Or was this the stuff of paranoia? The party heaved their rowboats onto the beach, puffing from the exertion. When this exercise was completed, and not a moment sooner, their watchful attendant, a young man dressed in curtain-thick, beige robes, approached to welcome them. His hair was short at the sides and ringleted on top, the colour of lightly roasted coffee beans. "Proctor Paquin Lingada, Karnik Lesher, welcome to the island of Isward," he said cheerfully, inclining his head. "My name is Anarian Cole, and I shall be your guide while you are here." "Thank you, lad," Karnik returned. "We wish to meet with your lord and lady at once, if possible. Unfortunately, we carry ill tidings, and it is essential we have their audience." Anarian bowed again, unfazed. "Very well. Let us proceed through the forest trail without delay. The main township is on the other side, where the crew of your ship may be fed and housed. I note too that you have left a group aboard the brig. For them I can arrange a delivery of meats and Iswardian wines, if you'd like." "Thank you. Your hospitality is greatly received, especially as we are weary from the passage," Paquin said. Anarian led them into the wet overgrowth of the forest. The canopies were so thick in some places that sunlight entirely struggled to lance through. All around them, sounds of life stirred, humming, chirping, the snapping of twigs, even the throaty proclamation of a toad. Trees passed them by, and at a squint their trunks wrinkled into facial features, wicked smiles and hollow eyes. Had Lennox been in their company, her bow would have almost certainly been drawn in untrusting anticipation. For a time they walked along the edge of a stream, and as they took in the pleasant, earthy fragrance of the forest, Anarian spoke of the Prior Loon Academy. He explained proudly how he was a recent graduate, specializing in elemental magic and complex diplomacy. When Caspar mentioned that they had until recently been accompanied by an elemental caster, his expression turned grave. "Ah, yes. Word of Ledis's tragic fate has indeed reached us, just yesterday," Anarian said, not looking back. "Mrs. Martolian oversees our great library. She will be disappointed when she learns that Ledis's sister is not within your ranks." though that is not your burden to bear. It's a disappointment to us too, Karnak replied. Yet we do not begrudge Lennox. She has things she must accomplish in the south, things that will hopefully bring a measure of peace to her mind. Eventually they reached a steep rise in the woods. After climbing it, another reserve of energy expended in the process, they were greeted by an ebullient partition of daylight. It marked the beginning of a clearing that extended for a few miles. Here the township of Isward revealed itself to be a pleasant arrangement of blue-domed stone structures, most of which neighboured generous vegetable gardens and multi-levelled troughs of herbs. A haven tucked between trees, there were paved pathways leading to wells, a row of market stalls, and a terraced performance area, but surprisingly little else in the way of obvious infrastructure. The main event of the settlement, and where one's attention irrepressibly drifted, was the vast rectangular building to the north, the Academy, where 4 towers rose up at its corners, and a temple, intricately carved and polished, clung to its side. Wow, it's just as Letus described, Nima whispered to Caspar. Her own magic instruction had taken place in the city of Karsten, and while this institution could not hope to compete with the reputation of Prialoon, it at least had the advantage of not being so remote. There is a guest house on the fringe of the town for your crew. However, for the 4 of you, Anarian said, indicating to Paquin, Karnak, Caspar, and Nima, you will be housed in one of the Academy towers instead, as honoured guests of the Lord and Lady, assuming that is amenable. That is gracious, thank you, Paquin said formally. And now, if you'll excuse my eagerness, when might we meet your leaders, please? Anarian bowed for the 5th time that day. I suggest we allow an hour for you to find your lodgings and freshen up. Afterwards, I will be happy to deliver you to the Hall of Remnants. The hall, it turned out, was nestled deep within the temple walls. As Karnak followed Anarian into the dimly lit chamber, his eyes adjusted to a gallery of statues, each frozen in a display of might or wisdom. One of these he recognized straight away, Cyril St. Jordica, in his dignified marble likeness, had a great sword clenched in both hands above his head, a second away from smiting an enemy. In total, there were no fewer than 20 historical figures represented, each of which had made an indelible mark on the continent and its surrounding islands. Most exceeded 8 feet in height, grander in stature here than in life. At the rear of the chamber, there was a sunken sitting room with a horseshoe of cushioned bench seats. A copper teapot steamed from the low table in the centre, and through this haze of heat and moisture, 2 sets of eyes watched them approach. One of these belonged to the Lord of Isward. Somewhat unusually, given his baldness, he wielded a wildfire of salt and pepper facial hair, plunging as far down as his abdomen. His face was impassive, unlike the woman who sat next to him. She was significantly younger, perhaps in her 40s, but with hair as white as the mist that gathered on the leechlands. When she beamed at them, Karnak sensed a bounty of kindness within her, and an undercurrent of sadness too. Allow me to present our visitors, Anarian announced, ever the stickler for protocol. A parade of names followed. Proctor Paquin Langada of Cyril, Karnak Lesher of the Broken Islands, Caspar Vartan and Nemadora Leybourne of Karsten. My friends, this is Lord Restaff Glane and Lady Hyla Zand Amaris. There were murmurs of greeting before everyone found their seats. Hyla carefully poured out the herbal tea, then distributed egg-shaped cups of the translucent, pale yellow liquid. Iswardians treat their tea very seriously, she remarked, flashing her amiable smile again. Our wine, too. If you have time, I would suggest visiting the vineyards on the other side of the island. Perhaps we will, my lady, Paquin replied, though unfortunately we come to you in less than favourable circumstances, and we do not expect to stay long. Restaff grunted. We received a report of some trouble in Cyril. Is this what you refer to? Yes, sir. My estate was attacked. This was after a fellow proctor was murdered, and his daughter, the most innocent of casualties. It was a sorceress Lavara, Karnak added. Ithgarod's lackey, a ruthless piece of work. She killed one of her own too, as he pursued her. I believe this news has also found its way to you. Yes, Hyla breathed, her cheerful disposition finally giving way. Dear Letus is a tremendous loss, and the wound is deeper in the knowledge that it was Lavara's doing, one who once walked these proud halls. She was always troubled, Ristaff grumbled, without elaboration. Kynek's eyes moved between them. Yes, well, we are now deeply concerned that matters are escalating. Targeting political leaders in foreign cities? Raising villagers on the edge of their border? Heightening tensions with Itelga? Kynek listed, his voice tapering off. Pardon the directness, but it would be helpful if you could clarify Esward's position on this Vizican aggression. There was an uneasy silence. Ristaff, stern-faced, sipped his tea. Naturally, we condemn Ithgarod's incivility, he finally said. Incivility? Kynek repeated. My husband has a slight aversion to hyperbole, Hyla quickly interjected, meaning that he sometimes errs on the side of euphemism. Rest assured, we are deeply disturbed by the southern ruler's actions. They're an abuse of his gift and a grave threat to the realm. Pequin smoothed her dress, heartened by the assurance. We are in agreement. Might I ask, then, in my capacity as a proctor, has Itelga formally requested aid from you yet? Cyril has been working through a package of support, but I must confess I am dismayed by the slowness of our response. Bureaucracy, it seems, is alive and well. The continent has enjoyed half a century of peace, relatively speaking. Ristaff cut her off in an apparent non sequitur. Decades of respite from the sort of heartless, unyielding fighting that was commonplace in the time of our ancestors, some of which are holding vigil in this very chamber. Jordica, Waverlin, Redingar, the original Wardens, guardians of state and country, whose feats of bravery have birthed 1,000 children's stories. It makes sense, does it not, that we are now tentative and slow to react to Ithgarod's brazenness? For we, and I count myself among these ranks, have been caught off guard after such a long period of calm, like the burrowing crab whose shell is exposed after an unexpected squall. His eyes, obsidian black in the shadow of the sitting room, bored into Paquin's. To answer your question, Proctor, of course Itelga has appealed to us. In fact, a unit of our best casters is bound for the White Rock as we speak, our hope serving as their tailwind. Sadly, experience tells me that whatever happens, we must brace ourselves for a protracted conflict. The air was heavy in the sitting room as Ristaff's words sunk in. Kynek was relieved, at least, to hear the old lord was being realistic about the magnitude of the threat, even if the conversation offered little comfort. Thank you for acting so swiftly, Paquin responded, picking her words discerningly. I trust Esward's engagement in the conflict will embolden the other city-states to enter the fray, mine included. Ithgarod is strong, but we must remember he is roundly outmatched by the rest of the continent. Hear, hear, Caspar blurted, breaking the polite silence he'd been holding. Nima giggled to herself at this, amused by his infusion of zeal. Even after all that had happened, and all that could still unfold, his spirit seemed impervious to true sorrow. That is true, Proctor Lingada, and well stated, Hyla said, her glow returning. However, observing that Ristaff's expression had not softened at all, she added, I apologize for the interruption, but I understand my husband wishes to speak to Kynek in confidence for a few minutes. Might I lead the remainder of you on a tour around the Hall of Remnants? We have so few visitors these days, it is rather a novelty. Perhaps you would humour me. With a nod of reassurance from Kynek, the others accompanied Hyla, who moved with the most ethereal poise back in the direction of the marbled heroes. Paquin looked over her shoulder gingerly as Ristaff shuffled closer to Kynek. You haven't changed, the Lord remarked, still in a gruff mood but helping himself to another cup of tea. Nor have you, Kynek replied. Except for the top of your head, that is, which is a mite shinier. Ristaff's lips parted in amusement, exposing a shimmer of even teeth. However, his mirth was gone almost as quickly as it had arrived. We don't have long, so I need you to listen, he pressed on. Your arrival on these shores comes at a pivotal moment. I fancy it is no mere coincidence. What do you mean? Kynek frowned. I mean what I say. Certain events have been foretold, years ago. Not much, regretfully, and what we do know is tenuous. For instance, we thought ourselves safe from the forces of evil for at least another few summers. Kynek thought of the teller, Ogmeda, and her prophecy which had so far omitted its punchline. Is this the reason you started the New Wardens? Partially, yes. Hyla and I envisioned mobilizing a group which was, to a degree, borderless, which existed to serve the common good of the continent, rather than the narrow political interests of any one state. I maintain it as a noble pursuit. Unfortunately, Ithgarod's expedited plans have caught the project in its infancy. Karnak was quiet, his mind suddenly transported back to a Custodian tavern years ago. He had just escorted a Visican merchant across the wild plains of the Verda, even defending the man one evening from a gang of wasting but determined bandits. It had been messy, a dogfight. While the merchant shielded his face from what he imagined would be certain, unceremonious death, Karnak had leapt to action, swinging his axe in brutal movements, liberating the attacker's innards and sending ghastly streamers of blood into the night. At the tavern, with his errand completed, he had then set to plying himself with as much liquor as it would take to relieve the grisly scene from his mind. This act of self-medication he had expected to indulge in alone, making his stance clear to the babbling server, but he was soon joined by a stranger at the bar, a man who could not be dissuaded by Karnak's less than warm responses, a man whose beard was a great deluge of hair. "I knew I could trust you to assemble a capable team," Restaff continued as Karnak's focus returned to the murky sitting room. "My people had observed you for some time and were pleased by their findings, not only with your brute strength, but your moral fortitude too. They concluded that you are not easily corruptible, unlike so many of your contemporaries. Power, the ultimate seductress, could not readily get her hooks into you, they told me." Karnak said nothing. He was disconcerted by Restaff's praise, which he knew was a resource frugally apportioned. He could hear the reverberating but indistinct voices of Hyla and Anarian from afar. A louder, more distinguishable query followed from Caspar. "Hey, who's this woman with the spiked flail over here?" "Anyway, I'm prattling," Restaff mumbled. "There will be an opportunity for further discussion at a later date. Simply put, this is what I need from you now. The girl, Nemadora, must remain in Esward for the foreseeable future." "What?" Karnak spluttered. "Why Nema, of all people? What does she have to do with this?" The Lord of Esward sighed. "Because Nema is special. Naive as you are to the intricacies of magic, surely you have suspected this from time to time. Her powers extend far beyond a run-of-the-mill mender. With intensive training at the academy, especially under the tutelage of our High Lady, who knows what she might be capable of someday." Karnak looked down at his hands. Small glass cuts from his ordeal at the Lingard estate were still visible. It was true, wasn't it, he thought. If Nema had not been present to subdue the sorceress, using that mysterious power which existed outside of her purview as a healer, they likely would have been doomed to become worm fodder. A choice of words he immediately regretted, as Ledis's unlined face fulgurated in his mind. Restaff leaned in close, so close that the noses were almost touching. His breath was hot and stale. "Trust me, Karnak. I understand it bothers you to do so, but many lives may depend on it. And if I confide in you why, you must not tell the boy, not a whiff." "Caspar, he is young and impulsive. We cannot discount the possibility that he may seek to smuggle her from the island. It's much cleaner to delay him in ignorance. I really insist." Karnak swallowed hard. He hadn't touched his drink, and as a result his throat was as dry as a rock face. In the presence of Restaff, he had to admit he felt humbled, less efficacious and sure of his own destiny. It was a feeling he resented. Earlier, aboard the Noonriser, he had made a promise to himself that he would try to remember the man's brilliance, his wit, his prescience, his encyclopedic knowledge of the continent, and set aside the more irksome attributes. Nobody was perfect. He certainly had no claim to that hallowed title, and an ally was an ally. "Tell me what you know," Karnak prompted, reaching for his cup. "About Nema. About everything." Chapter 12. Ensemble. Lennox, with a fright of windswept auburn hair, dismounted from her horse, the Silvermere River, then tethered her to a hitching post and joined the slow-inching queue outside of Itelga. Only a half-hour of light remained, and the other travellers were restless with impatience, shifting their weight between feet as one by one they were summoned to a desk and asked to present their papers. In front of Lennox, a shawl-wrapped toddler hung from her mother's neck, eyeing the Cyrillese archer with two curious, hazel-glowing moons. They exchanged a smile. While many years apart in age, Both were now equally lost, it seemed, upstream in a new era of dysfunction and insecurity. Writ of transit? A city guard demanded without looking up, his tone impersonal and strained from a long day's labor. My apologies, but I don't have one, Lennox admitted. She had learned of this complication while traversing the coastal road between Cyril and Itelga. A wiry priest of Aramandius, accompanied by his posse of acolytes, had crossed her path and delivered the unfortunate news. He had been friendly to Lennox, passing over a bread roll bulging with honey-glazed ham, but when he learned of her plans, his face became pallid. It's a mess at the White Rock, you know, the priest cautioned her, perhaps seeking to reorient her compass. Half the population is fluttering about, pretending all is quite well as they go about their usual business. The other half is hysterical, convinced there are Visican turncoats around every corner. Brothers will be turning on brothers before long. It's dire. In any case, you don't have a hen's hope of getting through the gates without special admission papers from your government. The Duchess is clamping down now. No one else is to leave, and no one may enter, unless they have gone through the correct channels. Lennox had not. Yet as she stared unbreakingly at the Italian sentinel, then proceeded to unpack precisely why she wished to join the city's wall of defence, in a voice both reasonable and assertive, she knew that something as trivial as a lack of documentation would ultimately not prevent her from entering. A man would need to be infirm, on the fringe of lunacy, she figured, to reject a helping pair of hands on the eve of war. Nonetheless, she offered a stack of mirror to sweeten the deal. Fine, the city guard capitulated. But just know, girl, if you are here on false pretenses, say to do the bidding of those Visican scum, you will be discovered, irrespective of how cunning you think you are, and the noble Assar will see that you are treated most unkindly. He flapped his hand towards the main street, then signalled for the next traveller. Apparently the conversation had reached its end. A warmer welcome I could not have hoped for, Lennox said sardonically, under her breath. In truth, she was relieved. She did not relish the thought of attempting to scale the fortifications, or more viably, bribing a fisherman to smuggle her through the harbour while she concealed herself in an alcove reeking of bait and fish guts. Without postponement, she collected river and rode on through the tall gap in the rampart. Itelga, balancing so angelically by the sea, had thankfully opened its arms to her spirit of vengeance, its milk-white brickwork untouched in that moment by the terrible kiss of war. In the north, Asher Emerine submerged himself to the neck in the hazy drink of his favoured Cyrilese calmhouse. It was searingly hot, the way he liked it, and as usual the attendant had secured his privacy. The bathing hall was reassuringly empty, free of watchful citizens, free of that lurking John Cade Bastinian too. Lately had felt under constant surveillance. Even his late-night walks, weaving back and forth across the canals of the old town, were now haunted by a sense that he was never entirely alone. There seemed to be eyes within every recess. Even the stars hunted him. I am becoming Paquin Lingada, vassal of my own anxiety, he pondered miserably. He had not detected any footsteps at the bath's edge, so he was startled when the attendant, like an apparition, began to speak. Proctor Emerine, forgive the intrusion. Might I supply you with anything? A flute of wine? No, I'm content just to soak. Very well, sir. The man turned to leave, but then hesitated, surprising himself. Perhaps you would allow one further trespass, Proctor? Asher raised an eyebrow. It was uncharacteristic for the attendant, so indentured to etiquette and discretion, to linger. What is it? He inquired with genuine curiosity. Oh, an observation, and a piece of unsolicited advice, from one who usually knows better, he ventured, eyes sweeping the floor. Logically, he understood it would be wiser to still his mouth, but he liked Asher, perhaps even saw something of himself in the enterprising boy. It has not escaped me that our city's governing council is, abruptly, 2 members short. This is unprecedented in modern times, isn't it? I ask this only because I've noticed there is something of a strange climate in the city. People are jumpier than usual. Well, yes, the killing of Proctor Silkwater came as a shock to us all, Asher said, judicious with his words. I'm told, from our early investigations, the perpetrator was probably a migrant worker. We have directed the constabulary to exhaust whatever resources are needed, to bring the cretins swiftly to justice. That way we'll all benefit from knowing the streets are safe again." "Ah, excellent news, and quite right," the attendant nodded. His hands fidgeted. "As for Proctor Lingard," Asher continued, trying to sound matter-of-fact, "she is merely taking a short leave of absence. I expect she'll be back in a week or so's time, disagreeing with me as petulantly as ever. I would really not worry about such things." The attendant nodded again, this time more vigorously. "That is also pleasing news. I apologize if I in any way exaggerated the situation." He turned to excuse himself. "Wait. Hmm?" Asher waded closer to the attendant, his body reddened and puffy from the raw heat of the pool. His curiosity had been piqued by the attendant's candid advance. Overhead, clouds of steam whirled along the ceiling like playful sprites. "You said you had an observation and a piece of advice. What was the latter?" The attendant regarded him closely, weighing up whether to speak frankly. It was a gamble, but had seen John Cade interfere with the lives of too many to remain idle. He made his decision. "It is not my place, Proctor, but I was just going to remind you that a person's allies are their most valuable asset. That is, when they are sincere in their loyalties. I remember when my children were younger, I once said to them, 'Never let yourself become a pawn to another player's ambition.' Well, I'm not sure how much they listened to me back then. A parent's words are like dandelion seeds in the wind at that age. But it's true. There are some in this world who will use you as a footstool. And worse still, when their power becomes bloated, they might just let your back break for the privilege." Back in the south, Roma de Nobilis woke to Lysith's movement. He was next to her bed, stretching in the light of the moon. When he turned sideways, pulling back in what could only be described as a self-admiring flex, his lower appendage became visible, half-masked in silhouette. Roma noted that it lacked some of its earlier heft and splendor now that her appetite for him had been satisfied. "How in Aram's name are you still aroused?" she whispered with a flush of amusement. "You lascivious boy." "Shh," the knight chided, then bent over the bed and pecked her forehead. "I can't sleep, Rome. My mind is in knots." Somewhat fantastically, and as further proof that her imagination had intensified recently, she envisaged peering into the well of his ear and finding a tangle of wriggling, sibilating snakes at the bottom. Knots, indeed. She wondered if her fanciful daydreams of late were a coping mechanism, switched on perhaps as a distraction from the coming war. Conversely, maybe the small life growing inside her, one day to be released into the world with all the whimsy and wonder of youth, was rubbing off on her. "I am unaccustomed to this nervous side of you, Lysith," she returned. "It's rather like spotting a rare bird. I shall commit your timorous appearance to memory. The picture can serve as a counterweight for when you are back to your usual self." He offered no reply to this. Instead, he moved to the bay window which overlooked the palace garden and dropped anchor into the seat. The light seeped into his skin. Roma saw how scraggly his facial hair had become, how his skin stretched across his face more tightly than before. After a few long minutes of silence, he spoke. "Magwile doubts me," he said. "He thinks I'm reckless and out of my depth, doesn't he, Rome?" He delivered these words in the tenor of a child. Roma was thankful to be veiled in the darkness, her pitying expression obscured. "Mag can be a difficult character, bewildering at times even, but well-meaning. He served our city faithfully, Lysith, through father's rule and my own," she said. "Well, I think he's pompous, and when he interrogates me with idiotic questions in front of the other men, it's a cheap attempt at humiliating me." She sighed. When Lysith was in a mood, it was nigh impossible to reason with him. Only time, and if she wanted to quicken the process, subtle flattery, would thaw him from the present state. She recalled her first meeting with him, this wonder boy of the Noblessar, now the father of her budding child. Back then he had been freshly recruited to her personal guard, poached in the settling dust of Atalga's annual tournament of duels. His flaws were more elusive then. At a banquet to mark the close of festivities, the sort of affair she usually found onerous, she remembered him catching her eye across the ballroom. Lysith, Perengul, an artist with a sword, fine-featured and hailing from a respected family to boot, he seemed equipped with all the bells and whistles of a quality suitor. Only his age, a decade and a half younger than her own, presented a minor problem, one chiefly of optics. Yet she had to admit she was drawn to his roguish manner and found it on full display that particular night. He had taken her hand and kissed it tenderly in front of everyone, his lips languishing too long at her knuckles. The nerve, she'd thought, and the exhilaration, to be so desired by a knight of his caliber. Part of her enjoyed how he cast off the chains of custom too, for she had lived an utterly choreographed life. Even after her father's abdication at the height of her power, she was still told to stand here, wear this, behave like a lady, only take small gulps of tea. It was exhausting. Roma dragged herself up from the bed, joining him at the window. Below her suite, the feathered jewel ferns hung darkly in the garden, each stem birthing 2 rows of spindly fingers. The scene was quiet, but for the dampened footsteps of the palace watch and a distant trickle of water. As she put her arm around his waist, she heard him say in an odd, claggy voice, "Telga will not fall." And then he began to shake, which at first seemed more like a twitch, like a cat expelling a clump of fur. "Lysith, are you all right?" There was no need to answer. She realized then, in the cool night, and through suppressed sobs, he was crying. Deep in the Leechlands, Ithgarod paced in his war tent. He ought to have been readying himself for bed, conserving his energy so that he was fresh for the following day's march, but instead his mind was hot with excitement. The campaign had begun. Vizika, a kingdom reborn, was on the move, justice in her stride. What came now was the usual 2-step of war, great stretches of waiting, bookended by the thrilling coalescence of steel and flesh. In the clash there would be a mad combustion of the human spirit, by which one either burned out to a stub or rose in an impetuous flare. This was the story of humanity, the way it had always been, through the vicissitudes of time, and the way it always would be. Ithgarod ran his calloused hands together, warding off the cold. There was still audible chatter beyond his tent walls. Apparently the soldiers were as restive as he was. He debated for a spell whether to insert himself among them, perhaps exchanging war stories while they polished off their supper. Would it energize them to be treated this way, as equals, as old friends? Or would his appearance feel like an intrusion and set them further on edge? It was a moot point. Just then Cleavertooth opened the flap of the tent and pushed through a bloodied young man. He fell to the ground, yelping on the descent. "Pardon the interruption. I've a present for you, my lord," Cleavertooth announced with a predatory sneer. He seemed terrifically pleased with himself. "We've found an Telgan spy, or slug more like. My men caught him sneaking in the swamp." Ithgarod looked closer at the prisoner. His face had been bludgeoned, leaving behind a collage of angry welts. "You're a Telgan?" he asked. The boy nodded. "You admit this freely? No ruse?" "What's the point? I'm dead no matter what I say." Cleavertooth kicked him hard in the ribcage. "Mind your manners, little slug." Ithgarod lifted a palm. "Bring him to the table," he said. "I should like to enjoy a nightcap with our courageous spy." Cleavertooth wrenched the boy upward by his forearm, depositing him in the wooden chair opposite his lord. Ithgarod poured out 2 shots of clear alcohol. "Vizikin's salt tonic," he explained, launching it down his gullet. "Your turn." The boy looked from the shot glass to Ithgarod, then to Cleavertooth, who was leering nearby. The general, who'd taken to him like a mortar and pestle, was staggeringly ugly, as if a blind child had moulded him from clay. "Go on," the southern ruler insisted. The liquid stung a little as it travelled down the boy's throat. Still, in spite of the briny aftertaste, it was not as unpleasant as he expected. Ithgarod replenished the glasses. "Have you been to Vizika before? Properly, I mean, the city." "No." "Why not?" The boy hesitated. "I've had no cause to." Ithgarod smiled blandly. "I suppose our patch of the world pales in comparison to your white rock, or the thousand-bridge city." There was a contemptuous snarl from Cleavertooth's direction. The boy's head hung lower, as if buckling from the weight of the world. "Some are of the opinion that Vizika is unsafe," Ithgarod continued. "Rubbish, if you ask me. It's no more or less dangerous than any other city of its size, even in the Mud Quarter. True, we're partial to a revolution. So what? A volatile society is not necessarily an unhealthy one. At least we as a people are prepared to clamour for change. You, Itelgan, seem all too mind-numbingly appeased with your ancient hierarchies and false idols. It escapes me why. He brought the shot glass to his lips again. So what did you hope to glean from this act of espionage, blundering as it was? An appreciation of our scale, a taste of our morale, what? The boy paused briefly, gathering his hate. Slowly, through gritted teeth, he said, I wanted to see you, to make sure you're as ordinary and pathetic as they say. Cleavertooth moved with a viper speed that seemed to defy his gargantuan mass, walloping the prisoner hard on the head. His skull connected with the table in a vicious crack. I hope that was worth it, Ithgarod said darkly, finding that his hospitable spirit had turned frigid. He faced his glowering general. Once a lowly miscreant of the Mud Quarter, Ivano had metamorphosed into a creature of undistilled terror and vindictiveness, a boogeyman for a new generation of children. What he lacked in subtlety and intellect, he made up for in dog-loyal, unquestioning service. The Itelgan is useless to us, that is plain, Ithgarod stated. It's time, I think, to sever him from his misery. Northward, not too far from the encampment, 2 more spies crouched in a sodden field of straw-like reeds and dwarven trees, branches leafless and skeletal. The man and woman had been creeping forward on the balls of their feet when something halted them. On the ridge ahead, a tall wooden structure had been erected, probably in short order. Affixed to the top of it, horrifyingly, was a person, an observation corroborated not only by the shape, which they could only just make out, but by the hopeless moan that now reaped its way through the night. They exchanged a disturbed glance, wondering whether to recede or draw nearer for a better look. Just as they were mulling, however, the structure came to life in a great roar of flame. A breath of heat rolled over them, and they turned tail immediately, suddenly weary of their position in the open swamp plains. They were loyal to their Duchess, of course, but their lives still meant something. Serving as a beacon of warning, the pyre burned ravenously until there was nothing of the post left. Only a bundle of charred bones remained at its foot, bones that would never be claimed or consecrated. When enough rain had fallen, they would simply sink into the peat. Chapter 13. His name is Rage. Gather your armies and speak softly to the dead. Let them know you shan't be joining them. A Telgan proverb. Lennox braced herself in a trench between 2 buildings as projectiles hammered down in the vicinity. The missiles varied in design. Some were a scramble of jagged rocks destined to impale and crush, while others were comprised of tightly compressed tree matter, mangled together in a ball and ignited. These were easier to avoid on impact, but that was only half of the challenge. As well as dripping embers along their earthbound arch, once they hit, their wreckages were a smouldering liability that needed to be immediately dealt with, otherwise the whole city risked going the way of Sagetown. It was a transparent strategy from the Vizicans: divide and disorientate. Lennox strained to listen. Far off she could hear the metronomic clanging of a battering ram striking an iron gate. So soon? This meant Itelga's outer force had already retreated inward. It had been alarming enough when the catapults first moved into range, but this was truly ominous in its prematurity. Sensing the skies were still, she moved to liberate herself from the tight squeeze of the alleyway. Unknowingly, however, her hair had snagged on a spike of debris. "Shit!" she cried, as a clump of hair tore away. She was far past the point of worrying about her appearance, but this useless pain she could do without. Lennox had intended to be in the thick of the fighting already, loosing her arrows from behind the vanguard. However, a disturbance had broken out in the square which her guest house overlooked. Shortly after the first blasting of Ithgarod's horns, a gang of men, some with surprisingly unsophisticated weaponry, chef's knives and the like, had commenced their own massacre from within the walls. Quickly and predictably, the city guard had put down these insurgents. but not before civilian blood was spilled. Their devotion to Ithgarod shook Lennox. How they must have infiltrated the city, perhaps even weeks earlier, enmeshing themselves in the culture and community of Itelga, only to toss their lives on the bonfire in a fleeting burst of treachery. Further raids followed. Offering her service to the city guard, they secured the streets as best they could, then proceeded to 3 different temples that were serving as shelters. In the catacombs beneath, elderly Itelgans locked hands and whispered faint prayers. Their grandchildren, mostly strangers to each other, ran around the dungeons playing tag and hide and seek. Though their laughter was out of place, it was a comfort. They're safe for the minute, one of the guards said with palpable relief. What will you do, my bow-slinging friend? Lennox now stood atop a battlement, gathering her bearings. The harbour was congested with warships, arrows streaming from their flanks. Larger bolts, the type offloaded by ballistas, appeared in less frequent intervals, ripping through the opposite ships' bodies with devastating aplomb. She wondered what her brother, Letus, might have made of the spectacle. Would he have been tempted, irreverently, to make light of the situation with a dollop of sarcasm? No, she thought. Not here. Not this time. Further along the walls, Lennox observed that a group of casters were readying themselves for engagement. Underneath their light and maneuverable chainmail, they wore the beige finery of Esward. So, Itelga is not wholly on her own, she reflected, though in truth she had witnessed only the smallest posting of Castonian soldiers, and shamefully not a single emissary from Cyril. The old triumvirate was truly in tatters. Suddenly the casters raised their arms in unison, elbows jutting towards the matron sea. A titan wave began to form. They're going to capsize the Visican ships, Lennox realized, with a ripple of excitement. Just as they were preparing the surge, however, there was a skyward screech. A pair of wyverns with lank, silvery bodies swooped towards their position. In the direct light, their scales shimmered and gave the impression of being slick with moisture.
Shit! Watch out! He's deployed his pits!
One of the casters shouted. Their formation broke just in time to evade the first tornadoes of flame. Lennox fired repeatedly into the air, trying to swallow her panic. The wyverns moved in unpredictable patterns, oscillating between darting and gliding, which made pinning them down all the more tricky. At last, they spun around for another assault. This time, the casters were ready. Their hands crackled with lightning. Boom! Lysith tended to his men behind the gate, administering in the haziness of a waking dream what paltry first aid he knew. Some of the soldiers were basted in their own blood, clutching at wounds of ghoulish design. One, a boy he knew from the training academy, was revenant pale and empty in the eyes, his voice reduced to a monosyllabic choke. Somehow, Lysith had emerged unharmed, his newly forged armour coated, broken in with the red speckle of Itelga's enemies. Only he seemed to be in shock. What in Aram's name happened outside of that wall? He recalled the feeling of confinement with the notion of armour and weaponry, the silver and yellow of Itelga meeting the austere navy of Vizika. He recalled too that in such close quarters the fighting had been grubby and inartful, nothing like the nightly sparring he was used to, not to mention oppressively hot under the watchful sun. But had he been the one to call for their temporary retreat? How many lives had been sacrificed to ferry them safely through the gate? His head throbbed. "Sir," came the voice of his second-in-command, Pinograve. "Sir, I'm pleased to see you unharmed. Might I suggest some encouraging words? Our soldiers must have stoic hearts and clear minds to stave off the Visicans when they break through." Though he was a friend, Lysith beheld him almost as a stranger. His helmet had taken a clobbering, clamped, it appeared, by a giant's teeth. "What are you saying?" he replied dumbly. "Sir, a rousing speech, a rallying cry. We need something to wake them from their malaise." In his mind, Lysith saw the vast swaths of Visican warriors, supposedly a downtrodden people. There had been so many of them, far greater in number than any of the scouts suggested, and their ink-black banners, proudly bearing the keep of Castle Craldon, draped in a serpent-like flame, had dominated the skyline. He knew it was wrong, but he turned to leave. "You do it, Pinograve," he said over his shoulder, moving down the cobbled path. "You've always been an excellent orator. Better than me, certainly." He just needed a minute, he told himself. Just a minute to realign. Lennox sprung backwards, landing on her hide. She had narrowly avoided a tunnel of fire. To her right, one of the Aswardian casters shouted something indecipherable and manifested a whip of lightning from his hand. He flung it in the direction of the sweeping wyvern, snagging one of its slender feet. The beast wailed as it collided hard with the ground. Its lament was high-pitched and piercing, and a wintry shudder moved down Lennox's spine. At this signal, the casters, those not yet incapacitated, rushed forward, drawing their lightweight blades. One of them, in a fluid movement, skewered the dazed wyvern through the floor of its mouth, while the others hacked feverishly at it. They'd seen their opening and pounced. Lennox, meanwhile, squinted back at the sky. What had become of the other wyvern? She knew of the beast's penchant for cunning, so its absence was conspicuous, unnerving. At last a shadow emerged from the cloud. It rocketed back towards Ithgarod, propulsive as a meteorite. "Incoming!" Lennox screamed, snapping her bow upward. The embattled wyvern, recovering from its impact, also sprang to life, fighting back with a barrage of sharp wings. One of the casters was impaled through the leg, then dragged from the parapet as the creature made its clumsy escape over the side. His shrieks were sucked down the face of the wall, dissolving to nothing. A few seconds later, the approaching wyvern, which was at least a third bigger and pockmarked from battles long ago fought, stormed the battlements. Having brushed off all but one of Lennox's arrows, but misjudging the landing, the marauder struck the side of the fortification in an almighty thunderclap, sending an explosion of rubble toward her. She was briefly aware of being winded by the force, then being airborne. Lennox gazed helplessly upward. She saw the sky, innocent blue and foamy with scattered cloud, eclipsed by a blanket of fire. Then Ledis was in her mind, lip curled in his ironic way, a brother's pride emanating from him too. "You did what you could," he seemed to say, without making a sound. "You certainly caused a good ruckus." She plummeted to the streets below. Stumbling through one of Ithgarrod's leafy parks, Lysith arrived at a bench where he thought he could hole up for a while, just until he got a grip on his nerves, he reasoned. The area, lush and inviting as it was completely empty, which made sense. That day, citizens of the White Rock were doing one of two things: either actively participating in the city's defense, or seeking refuge, be it in one of the makeshift public shelters or in their home cellars. From a compartment in his chest armor, he withdrew a letter that he'd scribbled for the Duchess 3 nights ago. At the last minute, he decided not to hand it over. Now, with a shaking hand, he allowed his eyes to fall over the pitiful words. "Roma," it said, "I find myself swimming in thoughts that increasingly feel like doubts." He scrunched his nose a little at the lyrical style, an affectation he seemed to reserve only for letters. One of the few things he had to show for his high-born education, he thought disparagingly. "Each day, I wake in the hope that Vizika is no longer on the march, that Ithgarod has been visited by some kind of epiphany. Of course, I know this not to be the case. He is strident, to use Magwild's word, and imperial through and through. And he will not stop by his own free will. So we must stop him. But can we?" And then, in messier cursive, "Is it strange that I recognize some of him in me?" The note carried on down the page in this vein. When he was finished with it, he let it breeze from his hand, and it hopped along the grass before catching on the root of a sanguina tree. It was a mature tree, he noticed, a little distractedly, remarkably similar in musculature and form to the one outside Nadia's house. No, he winced. He jammed his eyes shut, willing this problematic line of inquiry away. What a sorry state of affairs had landed himself in. Ithgarod and his army fought with the conviction of the divine. Had the gods, Aramandius, Azera, taken up residence in his camp as sponsors of his barbarism? It wouldn't be the first time they'd betrayed the notion of goodness. How else could one explain the plague of model fever? He started to curse, but a sound over yonder, past the park's greenery, interrupted him. From a small brick rectory, boarded up and thus neglected as far as Lysith knew, a handful of figures emerged. They flaunted Vizika's night blue palette, and their battle garments were identical in make, except for that of their leader. His armor was more ostentatious, ribbed and sharp to the touch, like a king crab. Lysith's mouth dropped. Fucking hell, he thought, sobering. It's Ithgarod. Frantically, he racked his brain to make sense of what he was seeing. Magwild had inspected each structure in proximity to the outer wall for evidence of tunneling. Clearly in his haste or by fallibility of age, he had missed one. The error was egregious. Lysith took to his feet, drawing his blade. He was isolated, without reinforcement, and without the aid of the poison-tipped arrows that were supposed to disable the sorcerer. Nevertheless, and there was solace in this, he found that his knightly instincts had not entirely abandoned him. He marched toward the invaders, knowing at once what he must do. "Stop where you are," Lysith commanded. There were 4 soldiers in Ithgarod's orbit, and each of them raised their sword as he approached. "Your presence sullies the White Rock. I will not stand for it." Wasting no time, they advanced, the Lord of Visualiser hanging back, and a cry of steel followed. Lysith, never more focused in his life, aptly matched their movements, forgetting he was outnumbered, forgetting he was fatigued, and after a fierce trade of blows, lasting only a couple of minutes, he saw that he'd cut each of them down. "You're bleeding," Ithgarod said when the slaughter was complete. Lysith quickly reviewed the damage. The pain was minimal, but his left shoulder and upper leg gushed Merlot red. "Worry about yourself," he returned. "I just made dog meat out of your escorts." "So you did, young warrior," Ithgarod said. Was Lysith losing his mind, or was there a trace of admiration in his voice? The sorcerer reached out in a deft movement. Before Lysith could grasp what was happening, serpentine flames gnashed at his gauntlets, and the stupendous heat forced him to release his weapon. "Ah, you bastard! You cheat!" he yelled. "Fight me like a knight!" Ithgarod was in front of him. He seized Lysith by the throat and held him in place, absorbing what he knew would follow, a desperate rain of fists upon his chest. Lord Ithgarod, the infamous sorcerer of Visualiser, the Knight Sovereign, then unsheathed his own sword and drew it back. Through the slit in his helmet, 2 eyes as colourless as Visualiser glass studied the squirming knight. They were vacant of humanity, as desolate and cold as a battlefield after a bloody skirmish. He drove in the unrepentant blade. In the throne room of Ithgarrod's palace, a member of the Noblesse, one of the only left in the service of the Duchess and thus spared from the front line, entered, then whispered something hoarsely in Magwild's ear. The toad-faced advisor nodded, comprehension flowing over him in lugubrious totality. "I see. Thank you. Return to your post," he said. There was a quizzical look from the Duchess as the man left. "The walls are breached," Magwild said. Earlier they'd heard a great roar from deep within the city. This news substantiated their fears. "Aram, help us," she murmured in return. Magwild grimaced. Too late for that. There was the sound of a scuffle near the door, then a long, laboured groan. Mag scrambled to his feet and pulled a dagger, though he could not quite sell the appearance of being threatening. How had the Visicans broken through and arrived at their doorstep so swiftly, he wondered. It defied logic, even allowing the possibility that the Itelgan side had been summarily trounced. But then Magwild understood. Through the door strided Ithgarod himself, a sword in one hand and a vulture's egg of fire in the other. He was alone, ever the maverick. Now his helmet had been removed, revealing a face that was not exuberant in beauty, nor repellent either. It was a face like any other, except worn with time and struggle, its natural softness eroded by the responsibility of serving a complicated, angry people. "Where is Roma da Noblesse?" Mag pretended not to understand. "What do you mean? This is our Duchess." Ithgarod stared at the woman. She wiggled on the throne, eyes wide with fear. "You take me for a fool, Magwild." "What?" he gasped. "I know what she looks like. In Visualiser there's a painting of her in my house. I won't abide games." Mag knew what was coming and averted his vision accordingly. A few meters away, still in the royal seat, Roma's body double convulsed as she was eviscerated in a shower of fire. There was a terrible struggle, and then, with a contraction of the sorcerer's hand, the flame abated. Her remains slumped deep in the throne. "I ask again, if you wish to live and be useful once more, where is Roma? What pit have you flung her in?" "How do I know you will spare me?" Mag whined. Ithgarod took a breath, menace lingering in his jaw and wild eyes. I am told you are a pragmatic man. I welcome people of this disposition, as long as they are prepared to prove themselves, and indeed, Itelga has a long period of transition ahead of her. You could help make it as seamless as possible, as bloodless even, from this day forward. Meg watched the door. There was no movement or sound in the antechamber, only the bleak hum of war from the city beyond, garbled, heavy noise, like a bassoon played by a musician bereft of talent. If I scream for help, will anyone hear me? He thought. Will anyone come? The other cities. They will rise up in force now? Mag said. It came out as more of a question. Maybe, maybe not. There are pragmatic people all across the continent. Here and in Cyril, certainly. People who are perceptive enough to see that we have become a languishing race, beholden to simply going through the motions. All the while, mediocrity is elevated to the very top of our societies. There is obviously a better way, and yet we deny ourselves greatness. You know the word for that, don't you, Mag? Masochism. Mag chewed his lip, silent. His mind was whirring. Empire need not be a dirty word, Ithgarod continued in his pontificating way. This land had one once, imperfect as it was. Atelga, Cyril, Karsten, united in common cause. The rest of us, of course, relegated to bit parts, shoe-bearers, but the idea itself was not meritless. It was just the execution, the leadership, that failed. He fixed his eyes on the blackened corpse, seeing that the woman's hands rested together in futile supplication. Within the trapped space of the throne room, the smell had become nauseating. Visualiser now washes through your precious white rock, he said mirthlessly, turning back to Magwild. If you wish to survive the current, I ask one final time. Where is Roma? Once the White Rock's fortifications had been breached, chaos stepped through and tore about the streets. The Itelgans fought as valiantly as could be expected from a people unpracticed in real warfare, but their adversaries were better prepared. Indeed, with every small victory claimed, and every new square metre of ground occupied, the Vizicans asserted their supremacy in no uncertain terms. Itelga herself, once pristinely white, was now a canvas of dust. The bombardment had left her singed and scarred, and the ruin only grew as the day stretched on. The harbour too had become a graveyard for many souls, on both sides of the conflict in fact, for this was one area where Itelga near enough held her own. All that remained above water were a smattering of half-sunk wooden carcasses, and further inland a flotilla of ships less mutilated, including the vessel belonging to Captain Alea Pisano, which lay docked before a bank of grimy white steps. He smoked on the deck, his expression as unreadable as a waterlogged manuscript. Around him, his crew lowered life rafts into the water and set to fishing out any survivors still adrift in the harbour. The sun commenced its sea-bound slope. Across the matron sea, Nima walked the length of pebbled beach where the new Wardens had first arrived in Esward. Her satchel was lined with shells that she had plucked from gaps in the stones, some apricot-striped and in the shape of a funnel, others flat and wide, capable of breaking one's skin if handled incorrectly. Suddenly Nima stopped in her tracks, intuiting something strange. It felt to her, quite abruptly, like there had been a consequential shift, an unwholesome irregularity in the order of things. Rather than petering out, as these things tended to do, the discord persisted as she walked on, then in a flush ratcheted up inside her. She doubled over on the foreshore, unable to suppress a rush of hot bile. My Azera, am I dehydrated? I've only been walking for half an hour, she thought. But then the true source of the turmoil came to her, a seed of sombre understanding, planted by some unknowable force in the flower-bed of her consciousness. No, it's Ithgarod. She knew it, as surely as she knew of her love for Caspar, and Karnek, and Lennox, and Father Killiam, and that pretty silver mare called River. Nima rose to her feet, a little precariously, and faced the horizon. A breeze was riding in, one suffused with tenderness. As it brushed over her skin and through her light brown locks, she heard its music, a quiet requiem from a far-off shore. Ithgarod, she's in pain. I can hear her. I can hear her weeping.
Of all the money that e'er I had, I spent it in good company, and of all the harm that e'er I done, alas it was to none but me. And all I've done for want of wits to memory now I can't recall. So fill to me the parting glass. Good night and joy be with you all. Of all the comrades that e'er I had, they're sorry for my going away. And of all the sweethearts that e'er I had, they would wish me one more day to stay. But since it falls until my lot that I should rise and you should not, I'll gently rise and I'll softly go. Good night and joy be with you all. Good night and joy be with you all.
This concludes the first act of Spectacle of Power. There are 2 more acts to come, so please keep an eye out for any announcements regarding their release. Feel free to follow the project on Instagram at Spectacle of Power Podcast or via the Patreon link in the show notes. I'm really looking forward to updating this story in the near future. As always, if you'd like to know more about the world and its characters, the compendium, also linked in the show notes, is worth checking out. Thank you so much for listening.